Good afternoon. This is a regular City Council meeting for September 12, 2023. Would you please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Madam Clerk, would you call the roll, please?
Certainly. Councilmember Harmon?
Here.
Councilmember Friedman?
Here.
Councilmember Oscar Gutierrez?
Present.
Mayor Russ?
Here.
Councilmember Alejandro Gutierrez is not present. Councilmember Snedden?
Here.
And Councilmember Jordan?
Here.
All right, very good. We have some ceremonial items to read. Would you read?
Yes, we have item 1, Hispanic Heritage Month, and item 2, Employee Recognition Service Award pins.
We will be doing the employee service recognitions first due to the Hispanic representative being en route. So, Madam Administrator.
Mayor Rouse, I'm so sorry, but my list is not here. Can we take a brief pause while I go get that list? Thank you.
It's going to be one of those days.
Sorry. Right, so restarting. This is the time of each month when we like to acknowledge the service award, a service of our wonderful employees for people with 5-year increments of service to the city. So starting with those with 5 years, we have Dunya Saka, Building Permit Technician in Community Development, Alejandra Jimenez, Police Record Specialist with the Police Department, Hector Avila, Streets Maintenance Worker 2 with the Public Works Department, Ruben Badia, Streets Maintenance Crew Leader, Public Works Department, Daisy Hernandez, Administrative Specialist, Parks and Recreation Department. With 10 years, we have Jose Ramirez, Grounds Maintenance Crew Leader, Parks and Recreation Department, Dustin Mendenhall, Senior Waterfront Maintenance Worker in the Waterfront Department. With 15 years, we have Guillermo Zipres, Police Sergeant with the Police Department, Ashley Shu, Principal Engineer with the Public Works Department, Hugo Miguel Perez, Custodian with the Airport Department. With 20 years, we have Eric Just, Geographic Information System Coordinator, Information Technology Department, Rodolfo Saldana, Grounds Maintenance Worker 2 with the Parks and Recreation Department, Patricia Herrera, Office Specialist 2 with the Parks and Recreation Department. And finally, and here today to receive her pin and her certification is Lorraine Cruz Carpenter, Environmental Services Manager, Sustainability and Resilience Department. General comment? Yes.
Hello, Lorraine. Lorraine Cruz Carpenter, Environmental Services Manager for 25 years of service with the City of Santa Barbara. Lorraine Cruz Carpenter began her career with the city as a Special Events Coordinator in the Parks and Recreation Department on August 3, 1998. As the city's Special Events Coordinator, Lorraine implemented a standard permitting process and coordinated and managed over 100 special events in Santa Barbara, including Fiesta, Summer Solstice, and the 4th of July fireworks event. In this role, Lorraine also had the honor of serving on the Santa Barbara Organizing Committee for the 2002 Winter Olympics Torch Relay. In 2003, Lorraine became the executive coordinator for the city's Looking Good Santa Barbara program, where she led grassroots organizations of neighborhood groups and residents to address litter and graffiti issues and created the city's annual Spirit of Service volunteer recognition event. Assuming an Environmental Specialist 2 position in 2007, Lorraine expanded the division's programs and worked closely with community partners to develop and implement a single-use bag reduction ordinance. In 2019, Lorraine was promoted to Environmental Services Supervisor and oversaw business and school outreach, legislative compliance, and was integral into the organizing of the city's encampment response team and cleanup program. As the Environmental Services Manager from 2022 to present, Lorraine led staff in the development of the Clean Santa Barbara program, development of a 15-year solid waste franchise hauler agreement, and worked with her team to craft a 2-year work plan for the division. A central theme of Lorraine's career has been community, as evidenced by programs she has spearheaded and the legacy of relationships and beautification efforts she has created. However, Lorraine's most important creation has been her two beloved children, Mateo and McKenna Carpenter, with whom she loves spending her free time. So Lorraine, on behalf of the City Council, the residents of Santa Barbara, and your fellow employees, it is my pleasure to recognize your many accomplishments and thank you for 25 years of dedicated service to the City of Santa Barbara and our local community. You can say,
Thank you, Mayor Rouse and council members, for this recognition. It's hard to believe it's been 25 years. I clearly remember my first day with the city. I was hired as a special events coordinator, and my first day was scheduled on opening day of Fiesta. I was off to a running start of what would become a full career. I am honored to have served this community in so many different capacities, from boots on the ground working alongside volunteers to program development and managing a team. My work with the city has been diverse, sometimes challenging, but ultimately rewarding. Throughout the years, I tried to really listen to residents. I put myself in their shoes, and I worked with my coworkers to find long-lasting solutions. My goal was always to leave residents with a positive experience, knowing that there is a team of dedicated city staff working hard behind the scenes to make a difference. I am grateful to be part of this exceptional city team for so many years. The city is an organization where people tend to stay, so coworkers often become your friends and family, and that certainly has been true for me, and there's a bunch of folks back there that I consider friends and family. I am very proud of the work I have accomplished, and it is with mixed emotions that I announce my retirement at the end of October. I will take many fond memories of my work here into the next chapter of my life, which is doing my primary work as mother to my two children. Thank you so much for the privilege to serve this city.
okay, I saw Mr. Avila enter the room. If you join us, please. Just in the nick of time. This is a proclamation for Hispanic Heritage Month, September 15 through October 15, 2023. Whereas in 1968, President Lyndon Johnson recognized the observance of Hispanic Heritage Week, and in 1988, President Ronald Reagan expanded the annual observance by proclaiming National Hispanic Heritage Month from September 15th through October 15th, a period that encompasses multiple Latin American Independence Days. And whereas Hispanic and Latin American residents have always been an integral part of our beautiful city, enriching the local area as business owners, members of all segments of the local workforce, educators, students, volunteers, artists and performers, philanthropists, and active community members who contribute in countless ways to the very fabric of Santa Barbara. And whereas the Santa Barbara Public Library, local schools, area businesses, nonprofits, and organizations throughout our community will honor Hispanic Heritage Month with special programs, exhibits, and efforts to raise awareness and uplift Hispanic voices, talents, accomplishments, and lived experiences. And whereas the city of Santa Barbara is pleased to join communities across the nation in recognition of Hispanic Heritage Month. Now therefore I, Randy Rouse, by the authority vested in me as the mayor of the city of Santa Barbara, do hereby proclaim September 15th to October 15th as Hispanic Heritage Month in Santa Barbara, and encourage community members to participate in activities, events, and education to celebrate and support our Hispanic and Latin American neighbors. Congratulations, Mr. Avila. Would you say a few, would you like to share a few words?
Yes, thank you, Mayor Rouse and council members. Thank you so much. This is a very pleasant surprise. I just got a call 10 minutes ago from Councilman Gutierrez, if I was available, and I said, yeah, I'm on my way to show a vacant lot, because that's what I do in real estate. I said, but I'll tell my client to wait for me there. So this is more important. Anyway, so thank you so much. This is a reflection to me that our local government, that the Latino community is important to you guys to give some recognition. And I'm very humble, and it's a great honor for me to be the one who's receiving this such a great, beautiful award. I mean, I'll frame it for the rest of my life. Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone. On behalf of my board of the Hispanic Chamber of Commerce, the Mariachi Festival, our Latino Hispanic community, on behalf of everyone, I thank you so much. Appreciate it. Thank you.
All right, very good. Madam Administrator, are there any changes to the agenda?
No, Mayor Rouse, there are no changes.
Okay, very good. With that, we'll move to the consent calendar. Do you have some items to read, Madam Clerk?
Yes, Mr. Mayor. Item 4, grant funding for household hazardous waste collection and education resolution. The council adopt by reading of title only a resolution of the Council of the City of Santa Barbara authorizing the Sustainability and Resilience Director to execute all necessary documents and submit an application for grant funds from the California Department of Resources, Recycling and Recovery for efforts related to the collection and education of household hazardous waste. Item 5, Library Department acceptance of zip book grants resolution. Recommendation that Council B adopt by reading of title only a resolution of the Council of the City of Santa Barbara amending resolution number 23076, adopting the budget for fiscal year 2024 to accept a grant in the amount of $18,000 funded by the California State Library. Item 6, delegate authority to Airport Director to apply for and execute grants for airport infrastructure and planning programs, resolution. Recommendation the Council adopt by reading of title only a resolution of the Council of the City of Santa Barbara authorizing the Airport Director to apply for and execute grants and other transactional documents for collaboration on or participation in airport infrastructure and planning programs. Item 7, acceptance of Douglas Family Preserve Endowment funds from the Parks and Recreation Community Development Douglas Family Preserve Endowment, resolution. Recommendation of Council B, adopt by reading of title only a resolution of the Council of the City of Santa Barbara amending resolution number 23076, adopting the budget for fiscal year 2024 to increase revenue and expenditure appropriations by $55,000 in the Parks and Recreation Department fiscal year 2024 miscellaneous grants fund for the maintenance of the Douglas Family Preserve. And item 8, design services for the Cliff Drive Coastal Bike Route Gap Closure and Pedestrian Safety Improvements Project Resolution Agreement. Recommendation that Council B adopt by reading of title only a resolution of the Council of the City of Santa Barbara amending resolution number 23076, adopting the budget for fiscal year 2024 to appropriate funds for the design of Cliff Drive Urban Highway to complete street transformation project.
All right, very good. Are there any items that the council wishes to pull? And Madam Clerk, doesn't need to be anyone present, anybody on the line that needs to pull an item?
No hands raised, Mr. Mayor.
Okay, very good. And with that, I will entertain a motion on the consent calendar.
I'll move consent.
Moved by Harmon. Second by Freeman. And today, the voting machine doesn't work, is that correct? Are we going to do the ayes and nays?
That's correct, Mr. Mayor, so I'll be calling out the name of each
Okay.
council member for a vote. And this is a motion for the entirety of the consent calendar, motion by Harmon, seconded by Friedman.
Correct.
Very good. One moment. Okay, Councilmember Harmon.
Yes.
Councilmember Friedman.
Yes.
Councilmember Oscar Gutierrez.
Yes.
Councilmember Sneddon.
Yes.
Councilmember Jordan.
Yes.
And Mayor Russ.
Aye. Very good. Passes unanimously with all present. Councilmember Alejandro Gutierrez absent. Thank you. And with that, we'll move to public comment. I've got one speaker slip here in chambers, and if anyone's online, I'm going to ask you to raise your hand in the next couple of minutes, and we're going to cut off public comment. So with that, we'll go with Clint Orr as our first public speaker. Mr. Orr, our timer is not working, so our timer is going to be Ms. Gorman.
Like, hey man, get out of here. So,
Go right ahead. You have 3
it's
minutes.
working? Yeah. It's good to be here. Good to see y'all. I ain't running away, and I'm still running for president as an independent. I know nobody wants to hear that. So what my problem is right now, I want to talk about some of the problems of Santa Barbara County. So if I can help the existing problems of Santa Barbara County, then I would vote for me. If I can't, I would not. Does that make sense? I mean, there's a lot of things that are glaring right here that I'd like to see. I keep saying this, but the leaf blowers walking down the sidewalks, you can't walk your dog anymore in Montecito. It's like there's somebody coming at you, blows that stuff in your eyes. It's un-American. It is not. It is against the Constitution of the United States. So write that down. That's against the Constitution of the United States for someone to walk up at me on my sidewalk and my blacktop and poison my eyes and my ears and my face. That is unconstitutional. I don't agree with it. They got to stay within, they got to go back 100 feet. 100 feet from any sidewalk, okay? Please, go blow leaves. Don't blow sidewalks and poisons into everybody's face. This is wrong. And it's poisoning Santa Barbara County, so that's my number one. I'm starting a couple of polo teams.
So, Mr. Working, if you please keep it to the Santa Barbara City itself, please, because we have no
Yes,
polo
this
facilities
is,
here.
well, you have jurisdiction over who runs the leaf blowers, don't you?
In the city.
Well, then, tell them to stop. What, I'm going to tell them to stop?
Continue, whatever you're saying.
Okay,
Your time.
now I'm talking about polo, which is in Carpinteria, and it involves Santa Barbara and Montecito. So I'm allowed to talk about that, Mayor
We have
Ralph.
no jurisdiction over Carpinteria's polo grounds or whatever, so please, within this body, what we do is all we want to hear about.
Okay,
So
so
please
what
contain
do you
that.
do? Okay, what else do I not be? Why don't we got to clean up the bus stops? We got to clean up the air. The air here is really polluted. That's my biggest beef. We have plenty of water. We sell water. We have a blah 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 blah. We have a water purification center and a but we use leaf
20
blowers.
seconds left.
I see the seconds. I got it. So anyway, I think you guys should clean up the air. The air is going to kill us, not the water. So let's get it going, folks. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any speakers online, Madam Clerk?
No, Mr. Mayor.
Okay, very good. We have no pulled consent items. With that, we'll go to council member committee assignment reports. Anyone? Ms. Sneddon?
Thank you, Mayor Rouse. Briefly attended a press conference for MTD new bus lines that are serving City College. Also, as many of us attended Veracruz Village opening, Southern California Edison wildfire mitigation briefing. The State Street Advisory Committee had a meeting focusing mainly on transportation and circulation, Sustainability Council Committee meeting, and Kachuma Conservation Release Board meetings.
All right, very good. Anyone else with a committee assignment report? Mr. Gutierrez.
Thank you. Yesterday, I attended the Neighborhood Advisory Council meeting. Unfortunately, they did not have quorum, so it was canceled again. So this is 9 months into the new year, and I don't think they've had a formal meeting, and two other council members have resigned. So I just want to let you all know about that when it comes to picking, appointing members to that council to make sure that they can serve on there and make sure that they can be consistent. Oh, and some of them requested that we change the name from Neighborhood Advisory Council to Neighborhood Advisory Commission. Just thought I'd share that.
All right, very good. And this is a rather new thing. Barbara Anderson and I had lunch with Santos Guzman from El Bajío on Friday, and he's actually formed a 501c3. It's going to be called the Milpas Eastside Business Association, which I'm very encouraged about. And at some point in time, hopefully when they're up and running, we will talk about assigning a liaison to that association. So in the meantime, I will be the liaison for the time being. All right, with that, we'll go to the first administrative report. Madam Clerk, if you'd read the item, please.
Certainly, this is item 15, Reserve Policy Discussion and Direction, Ordinance Introduction Resolution. And the recommendation is that Council A, provide direction and adopt by reading of title only a resolution of the Council of the City of Santa Barbara establishing policies for reserves for the city's general fund, enterprise funds, and internal services funds, and amending Resolution Number 22-126. And item B, introduce and subsequently adopt by reading of title only an ordinance of the Council of the City of Santa Barbara amending the Santa Barbara Municipal Code by repealing Chapter 17.40 pertaining to the purpose, accumulation, and use of funds within the Harbor Preservation Fund.
All right, Director DeMartini.
Good afternoon, Honorable Mayor and members of the City Council. My name is Keith DeMartini, the city's Finance Director. It is my pleasure to present an overview of the city's reserve policy and seek your direction. The objective of today's presentation, as the clerk just read, is to provide direction and adopt a resolution approving of any revisions to the city's reserve policy, and also introduce and subsequently adopt an ordinance amending the Santa Barbara Municipal Code by repealing Chapter 17.40 and transfer those funds in the Harbor Preservation Fund into the Waterfront Capital Fund. The city does have a comprehensive reserve policy. There really is no legal requirement for a general fund reserve. There are no federal or state or municipal code requirements. It is a government best practice to have a reserve policy. There are reserve requirements for our enterprise funds, particularly when issuing debt, but for our general fund, it is really governed by best practice. And this slide summarizes what are some of those best practices. First, it provides financial stability to our organization. It allows us to dip into reserves in times that we really need it, and allows us to replenish it over time. It provides us with those resources to address disasters that may occur, and we have a recent history of needing to use reserves during the times of fire, flood, global pandemic. It also allows us to smooth our revenue volatility. Being a tourism-based economy, we have strong sales tax and transient occupancy tax revenue when times are really good and people are traveling quite a bit. But when the economy slows down, those revenues do dip more substantially than what is seen across the county and or the state. It also allows the city to achieve an advantageous credit rating. And that credit rating is used for when the city goes out to borrow funds for really specific critical projects, when we issue debt. We're planning to do so in the next 6 to 12 months with the issuance of debt for our new police facility. We have issued debt strategically over many, many years. And by having a strong reserve policy and achieving the reserve policy target with the actual cash, it does allow us to issue debt at favorable borrowing terms. And then finally, it allows us to address one-time projects and initiatives. So fairly regularly, the City Council will take action during a regular council meeting to appropriate money from reserves for a specific one-time use. A really recent and important example of that was the short-term rental enforcement program, where council took $1.1 million out of reserves to fund that program. This slide here summarizes what are some of the intended uses of reserves and what is really discouraged when using reserves. First, as I mentioned earlier, any one-time use, one-time occurrence, it is appropriate to consider using reserves for those types of programs. I mentioned the short-term rental program as an example, and then of course, responding to disasters. And the most recent disaster that we had with the storms in January, that cash that we had available immediately allowed us to respond. We didn't have to wait for FEMA or Cal OES reimbursement, which sometimes could take years. So having cash readily available helps us to respond to those events. Reserves really should not be considered. They're strongly discouraged to be considered for ongoing programs when there really isn't an ongoing revenue source to fund them. Also, any program that might have begun from a state or federal grant and those grant funds may have been depleted, that's also discouraged because again, it's an ongoing program, not using one-time funds, reserves for ongoing programs. The City Council does have one consolidated reserve policy. During the last budget cycle, the Finance Committee and the City Council took action to request that staff bring this item forward so that the City Council can consider any potential changes to the reserve policy. And there was also direction at Finance Committee to develop a plan to replenish those reserves over the next couple of years. The reserve policy does have a 10% contingency reserve target and a 15% disaster reserve policy target. We're just putting the finishing touches on our Q4 report that'll go before the Finance Committee and the City Council in 2 weeks. We have a projected operating deficit in the general fund of approximately $1.3 million, which is about where we had planned during the adopted budget and about where we were projecting through Q2 and Q3. That will require the use of reserves to balance the budget. And as Council is aware, we have projected deficits going forward. The reserve policy also has really clear language in it about when reserves are required to be used, that there is an assessment to be conducted, developing a balancing strategy, and also articulating a plan to replenish those reserves so that we can, as an organization, meet that reserve policy target again. The City Council took action just about 9 months ago to pretty substantially revise the reserve policy, and it made one consolidated reserve policy for the entire organization. This slide summarizes what those major changes were, the first and most significant one being the top one, whereas instead of 50% of any general fund operating surplus that may occur during the year, instead of that 50% going towards one-time capital projects, that will instead go towards the city's pension expenses and pension liabilities. And then these other items were also added to the reserve policy so that, again, we have one consolidated policy. That policy is attachment, I believe it's attachment 1 in your packet before you today. To help with this conversation, staff thought it would be good to do a little bit of a benchmark. Where do some other cities' reserve policies fall? This graph here is a summary of the survey results from a 2018 survey that was conducted by the California Society of Municipal Financial Advisors. And it shows Santa Barbara's reserve policy target of 25% compared to many other cities across the state of California. The average of this survey sample was around 22.9%. So Santa Barbara is just slightly above the average here. But because the results of this survey are rather outdated, and we wouldn't typically compare ourselves to many of these cities, they're not coastal, they may not have the same level of tourism, for example. Staff went ahead and did our own research on the next slide, and we graphed the results of eight cities, or 7 cities and the county of Santa Barbara, where we would more typically compare ourselves to. And this is data as of June, so it's very recent. And as you can see, the average of these cities is at 25%, which is where Santa Barbara's reserve policy target is. You can see 3 cities are above that, and 4 cities in the county is below. 25% represents 3 months of annual operating expenditure. And if you're at 16 or 17%, that represents 2 months of annual operating expenditure for these organizations. So that tends to be the target, anywhere between 2 to 3 months for these organizations. This graph here summarizes from fiscal year 2005 to today, and then a projection going forward, what the reserve policy target is per our policy of 25%. That's the red line on top. The black line shows what the disaster reserve policy target is of 15%. And then the gray bars show what our actual reserves have been. And you can see we have fluctuated. There were times in fiscal year 2008, 2009 where we have fully depleted our contingency reserves and then slowly built them back up over time. And then During COVID, you can see that the drop in reserves occurred. And then council took decisive action back in 2021 to appropriate the first tranche of the American Rescue Plan Act funds to continue to sustain our general fund operations, which ultimately had a positive impact on the city's general fund reserves and then projected deficits going forward. So we wanted to break out this slide in a little bit more detail. On this slide, what we did is try to summarize the major events or the major reasons why there were fluctuations in the reserves. Anytime you see a red bar going down, it shows an annual operating deficit, which means we had to use reserves. And anytime there was a green bar going up, it's where we had a resulting surplus in that fiscal year, showing a replenishment of reserves. So going back to 2005, 2006, when the Great Recession occurred, TOT and sales tax was coming in a lot lower, required the city to use reserves. And then 2009, the city's general fund began to stabilize, and we had an 8-year period where reserves were able to be built up slowly and gradually over time. And at the conclusion of the 8-year mark, we reached our general fund policy target level of 25%. And then the Thomas Fire and the resulting mudslides occurred, and you can see 2 years in a row, annual operating deficits. And then COVID hit, which had one of the most significant impacts to our general fund reserves in fiscal year 2020. And then with the implementation of ARPA, as I mentioned earlier, that had a positive impact on our operations and then also our reserves as well. And that led into really the economy roaring back in fiscal year 22 with record sales tax and transient occupancy tax revenues generated. And then also, we had a great deal of salary savings because we've continued to struggle to really fill positions at the rate that we would like to. So sort of the positive on the reserves comes from both additional revenue, but also decrease of expenditures. And then you can see our long-range forecast projections going out, deficits projected in each of the next couple of fiscal years. Staff is recommending one change to the reserve policy target before you today, and that is for the Harbor Preservation Fund. This is a reserve requirement that states that there should be no less than $2 million in this fund, but really a goal of $5 million for the waterfront department. At the end of fiscal year 2022, there were just over $2 million of reserves in this fund, so really the low threshold for this fund. The waterfront department also has a capital fund, very similar to all of the other enterprise departments. That fund has approximately $631,000 in it. So the request before you today is to eliminate the Harbor Preservation Fund by repealing section 17.40 of the Santa Barbara Municipal Code and then transferring the $2 million from the HPF into the Waterfront Capital Fund. And then the Waterfront Capital Fund will be governed like all of the other enterprise capital funds with language that's currently in the reserve policy. It really allows the Waterfront Department to more strategically and better manage their capital improvement program and just have their resources in one fund and manage going forward. And as opposed to having a set dollar amount of $2 billion, it really allows them to fluctuate that balance over time, depending on what their upcoming capital improvement program really tells them to reserve. So there are many options for the City Council to consider when potentially changing any of the components of the reserve policy. That could include changing the actual contingency reserve percent from 10% to something different. You could change the disaster reserve percent from 15% to something different. There are also requirements in the reserve policy about having funds available for capital. Those are also some options for the City Council to consider. It really is important to consider the current financial state of other city funds when thinking about the general fund, because the general fund is effectively on the hook for the self-insurance fund and the downtown parking fund, and the lack of reserves that are in those funds, which we'll talk about in a little bit more detail. Another consideration would be to consider how aggressive the city might be on its capital improvement program. That's always an opportunity to either delay or potentially change the way in which we deliver capital. There's language in the reserve policy today about considering a line of credit. So that is a financial vehicle that some larger municipalities use to have access to capital immediately if necessary, as opposed to having cash in the bank. And then it's also important to understand what potential impact there could be to our credit rating or our ability to issue debt when making considerations for changes to our reserve policy. There isn't necessarily a direct correlation between our reserve policy and our credit rating, but they do very much go hand in hand. So I want to talk about the two funds that should be considered when considering changes to our general fund reserve policy. First is the self-insurance fund, which we've been presenting on fairly regularly over the past couple of years. This fund is underfunded. By the end of the fiscal year, we will have approximately $5 million in the fund, maybe a little bit more. And the most recent actuarial report that we received indicated that we should have a balance of $24 million in the fund. So when just looking at those two numbers, we are $19 million underfunded. But we have a plan. Council has approved of a long-term plan to replenish those reserves over time. But as you can see, our reserve balance is going up. We're not necessarily closing the gap. And the way that this fund is funded is through expenditure increases in each of the operating departments. And so it means those costs in all those departments will go up. So this is something to consider. The general fund is on the hook for approximately 50% of how underfunded this fund is. So something to consider. The other fund that's worth noting here is the downtown parking fund. This fund is reported and sort of managed as an enterprise fund. It's not necessarily, it's not your typical enterprise fund like water or wastewater or the airport, but it is funded like an enterprise. So it's self-sustaining. It needs to be operating and be using its own resources that it brings in, not only for its operating expenses, but also its capital improvement program. And by the end of fiscal year 2025, the projection is that there will be approximately $1 million in the fund, and it should have a reserve level of $4 million. There really is no other fund that could help this fund in time of distress. If this fund were to go negative, the general fund would be on the hook for it, 100%. This item was presented to the Finance Committee about a month and a half ago, and this slide summarizes the recommendations from the Finance Committee. They were in agreement with staff's recommendation to repeal Chapter 17.40 of the Municipal Code, deleting the Harbor Preservation Fund and transferring those funds. They also were open to considering opening a line of credit. The Finance Committee also made these two recommendations that are before you today. First was to consider reducing the disaster reserve policy target level from 15% by up to 5%, resulting in potentially a 10% target level. And another recommendation was to consider directing the city administrator to prepare and issue the city's recommended budget in both fiscal year 2025 and fiscal year 2026, effectively showing a policy reserve target of 22%, with a plan to replenish those reserves to achieve the 25% target through efforts that are currently underway through fiscal sustainability and also the efforts under Vision 2030. So the request to City Council today is to provide direction to staff and ultimately adopting a resolution approving of any revisions to the city's reserve policy for the general fund, enterprise fund, and the internal service funds. And then also introduce and subsequently adopt by reading of title only an ordinance of the Council of the City of Santa Barbara, amending the Santa Barbara Municipal Code by repealing Chapter 17.40 pertaining to the purpose, accumulation, and use of funds within the harbor preservation funds. That concludes my presentation. I'll be happy to answer any questions you might have. Thank you very much.
All right, questions from council. Ms. Harmon.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Thank you so much, Mr. DeMartini. I really appreciate it. Just two questions. The first, I think how to introduce this. I think it was slide 8. Sorry, I didn't write it down. The one that, go back to 10. This is perfect, thank you. What I'm trying to understand is, so we have these two funds. We've got the contingency reserves and the disaster reserves. My understanding is that in times of disaster, let's say from 2006 on, we have totally spent all of our contingency reserves, but have we ever fully depleted our disaster reserves?
Councilmember Harmon, there are, if I may go back to actually slide 9, it will actually show that in a little bit more detail here. We have never fully depleted our reserves in the history of the city. We have depleted our contingency reserves, which is shown here in fiscal year 2008 and 2009, in which we did for a period of time in fiscal year 2021 before the American Rescue Plan Act was legislated. But we have never depleted our disaster reserves.
Do you have an estimate? I mean, I can sort of estimate by looking at this, but would you say in the worst case, since fiscal year 2005, we've dipped into our disaster reserves by 1%, 2%? Is it we went in 12%? I mean, I'm looking at this, but can you give me that number? What's that delta of how much in the worst case scenario since 2005 have we spent our disaster reserves?
Yes, Councilmember Harmon, it's probably best to look at fiscal year 2008, where we have fully depleted our contingency reserves of 10%. The target level was, according to this graph, around probably $28 million, and we had approximately $17 million in reserves, so that's a use of $11 million. So we used $11 million of reserves in that year.
So, I mean, I can't do that math quickly enough, but what percentage of the disaster reserves did we, I mean, I guess I can do the math when
Yes.
someone else is talking.
So it's
but-
11, so it's, let me do a quick calculation.
Sorry.
No worries.
Shouldn't have brought my calculator.
That's 40%. It's 40% of the total reserves.
But, so what I'm trying to get at is what percent of the disaster reserves were used? I understand we used 100% of contingency, and we dipped into disaster. And by how much did we dip into that disaster?
Councilmember Hartman, thank you. So the reserves sit all in the same bucket, contingency and disaster, right? So we probably used a very, very small percentage of disaster reserves is probably the best way for me to answer that.
Thank you. Sorry, I know. I understand, and I'm sorry to push on that, but thank you very much. And then just my only other question quickly. Our reserves are limited by state law as to how and where we can invest them, right? There's a specific fund, a LAIF maybe, or I don't know where it is, and it's a very, very small return that we get back. Is that correct?
Yes, Councilmember Harmon, government code has very, very strict requirements of how we can invest these funds to earn interest. We maximize our ability to invest in LAIF, it's approximately $75 million. And then we do have a number of certificates of deposit, which are very safe investment instruments with banks, and then U.S. Treasuries, and then federal agency notes. And we have, the investment report is a common report with city council packets, so you can see that on a monthly basis.
Thank you. So if we decided to keep the reserve policy as is, but say we wanted to invest it differently into different investment vehicles specific to this community, we really wouldn't be allowed to do that. There's codes that very specifically determine where and how we can make those investments.
Councilmember Harmon, that is correct.
Okay. Thank you.
Mr. Jordan.
Afternoon, Mr. DiMartini. I'll spread around a little bit. You talked about the self-insurance fund reserve balance gap, and did you say 50% of that was, I'm sorry, 50% of the gap on the self-insurance fund reserve is funded, would be funded by the general fund? Is a general fund obligation?
Councilmember Jordan, that is correct.
So the other 50% is obviously at the burden of ratepayers, right? Is that where it's coming from?
Councilmember Jordan, it would be ratepayers through the water and the wastewater funds, but also the airport, the waterfront department, the clean energy program, the self-insurance, the internal service funds like IT, facilities, fleet, across all of the, basically the entire organization.
Yeah, so I'm kind of just making the point, the gap is funded 100% by somebody trying to catch up to it or not, right? It's not just that it's a general fund problem, it's also a problem that I'd be paying more of a water bill, one of the two water bills, or these other places too, right? Okay, and then on that, that set of slides, the first one's, I think, 9, the general fund reserve balance. So even if you, and they're your projections, so I'm just going to say there are projections. Even if you siphoned off, that'd be the wrong word because you're not really siphoning. Even if you reduce the obligation, the current obligation by 10% in like fiscal year 23 or 24, the gain there would be projected only like $3.5 million, right? You wouldn't have to fund the 10% of $35 million that exists on this page right now.
Yes, Councilmember Jordan. So if council took an action to reduce the reserve policy target, it would bring down both, well, it would bring down the red line for sure. It would just change the target. It wouldn't change our projection of how much actual reserve we project to have in the fund by the end of those fiscal years.
Except you are projecting that you will get to that point of the gray line, right? Of having that much.
Yes, Councilmember Jordan, yes, the gray line represents our
If we reduce that
actual.
requirement, we would, in a sense, have some cash on hand, right? That's not going into reserves.
Councilmember Jordan, in
Is that-
each of those fiscal years, it shows a pretty substantial shortfall of projected reserves compared to the reserve policy target. And so if the goal were to have a target where we had excess reserves, that percent target would have to come down substantially.
Okay. And any of that gain, though, where I'm going is I'm trying to figure out these two graphs together. Any of that gain on the next page would automatically be eaten up in those projections of future deficits as they exist now. In 24, some of it, a significant amount. In 25, more than the number you're talking about. And in 26, a little more than in 24. It'd be like a one-time gain to a future obligation that's coming, and you still wouldn't be freeing up resources to do things with that money if you wanted to do things with that money that's less of a reserve burden. Is that making sense, the way I'm explaining it?
Councilmember Jordan, I believe so. So changing the reserve policy level, it's a one-time adjustment to the target. So it's how we evaluate the actual or projected reserve level versus the target level.
And then it's potentially offset immediately by the time you get to the next fiscal year when our deficits grow, right? Because you have to have the money to come from somewhere.
Councilmember Jordan, that's correct.
Okay. And then another way to play with the reserves, of course, would be to lower the overall operating budget because it's a math function too, right? You build those reserve targets, whatever number they are, based on a percentage of the overall budget, right?
Yes, Councilmember Jordan, that is correct. The reserve policy target is 25% of the next year's annual operating expenditure. So if next year's annual operating expenditure is $100 million, the reserve policy target is $25 million. That's correct. So if expenditures were to come down, the reserve policy target amount comes down proportionally.
And then you made a point about bond creditworthiness. Can you tell me, where are we in the police department process line for that? Are we to a point where we have our bond settled, out to market, or is that still coming in the future?
Councilmember Jordan, that will be a very extensive process that will come to City Council in the coming months as we get closer to finishing up the construction documents and get ready to go out to bid. So both the debt issuance process with going out to bid, those processes go hand in hand. A requirement of issuing the debt will be obtaining a credit rating. So we will go through a process with the credit agency to get a credit rating for the issuance of that debt. So that all of that will be a very detailed process with the City Council.
And does that process just actually look at financials as they currently exist, or does it take into account policy changes that haven't hit yet but are coming?
Councilmember Jordan, The credit rating process is a very extensive process, so it will look at many factors, including our prior fiscal year financial statements that have been fully audited. It will review any audit findings on those reports. It will look at our adopted budgets. It'll look at especially the upcoming fiscal year's adopted budget. It will look at many of our policies and procedures, including our reserve policy, our investment policy, our debt management policy. It will also look at other factors across the economy, like how volatile our revenue sources are, what reserves we have in other funds, what impacts there might be on the general fund because of those other funds. It is a very extensive process.
Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Ms. Nedden.
Thank you, Mayor Rouse, and thank you for this presentation. I'm really appreciating the extra color bars between there to show the ARPA funds, which has been so hard for me to understand what that big bump is. So on slide 10, just to start with a question here. So the big drop in 2025, projecting long range, what are we attributing that to? It's almost as big of a drop as COVID times.
So Councilmember Sneddon, those are our forecasts when we just basically assume the same level of services that we've been providing and ongoing continued revenue growth from our existing revenue sources, no new revenue. The main change from fiscal year 24 to 25, why that's so substantial, I believe is primarily due to the projected increase of our UAL payment. It's our unfunded actuarial liability for pension. It follows on this 20-year amortization table, and in that year is sort of a peak and then sort of a correction, then it will continue to kind of go up and then level off.
Thank you. And is that why it's not smooth there? There's a dip and then it rebounds a little and then a dip and rebounds. And then after that, 2026, you expect it to level off at around that 2 million or?
Councilmember Sneddon, that is correct. The dip in 25 is due to the amortization. It's that the amortization table. And the 20-year graph has it go up for about, I believe it's 4 or 5 years, and it kind of has it sort of gradually come down over a 20-year period. Now that we do get an updated valuation report from CalPERS every year, that does show that 20-year table, assuming that we will have a liability to pay off really every time, any time into the near future.
Appreciate that. Thank you. And could we go back to slide 9 for a second? And maybe you could help me with how I'm sort of framing this in my head, and it might help with what the, I don't know, recommended changes to the projections. But I sort of see the buffer line or the variance being between the black line and the red line, and we go up and down sort of in that zone. So maybe our effective policy reserve stays somewhere between 15 and 25%. Is that, can you sort of help me when I'm thinking of it that way, is that we're staying within what percent band of our policy target?
Councilmember Sneddon, the reserve policy target is 25%. So anytime that we're below 25%, we're not meeting the reserve policy target. That black line we added because we believe it was important to see sort of how close we come to really operating in disaster mode, where we're in disaster reserve territory, which we have been close to on a couple years during this long-range trend. And then before ARPA was legislated, we were there.
I'm really appreciating this, actually. So if we had something like a policy to not, to have the goal be 25% and not to dip beneath 15%, that's something that could be reflected in this graph.
Councilmember Sneddon, the information here would be reflected the same way as you indicated, but if that is how council would like to interpret the reserve policy, then I believe that council should take an action to rephrase the language in the reserve policy to state that.
Okay, thank you. I'm actually just going to say I'm not really in favor of changing it. So, and this is actually really helpful to me to frame why. So then I have just a couple more questions. What was the source of the Harbor Preservation Fund previously, like, why are those two separate funds?
Director Wiltshire.
Mayor Rouse, council members, Councilmember Steddon, Mike Wiltshire, Waterfront Director. It was really put in place in addition to our capital reserve. From the way I understand it, it was there as a kind of a storage spot for even larger scale projects down the road. In the time that I've been there, it's really been used as the capital reserve, so it's just sort of acted as the fund that we pull to execute our annual recurring capital projects out of. And so Mr. Martini mentioned it just has become outdated over time, being fixed to set dollar amounts and not being in line with how other enterprise funds do it. So, and every time we have our budget presentation, a lot of questions come up about it. And so it's just kind of it's been a little more confusing. So from a budgeting point of view, us being able to project our 3 years of coming capital and tie that to our capital reserve just makes a lot more sense.
Thank you. And then just two more questions here for option 4 on the last slide there. So this would be not a change of policy. This would be that we keep it at 25%, but we have sort of like a pragmatic goal for a given year of what we think we can replenish to over time.
Councilmember Steddon, that is correct.
Okay. And then what is your recommendation?
Councilmember Steddon, my recommendation is to keep the reserve policy target as is, to keep it at 25%, and to repeal the Harbor Preservation Fund.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Friedman.
Thank you. Just a few questions. If you could start with slide 9. So I just had a question. So fiscal year 21, the green is the ARPA. How much did we put in from the federal ARPA dollars? What is the total of that green bar?
Councilmember Freeman, the first tranche of the American Rescue Plan Act gave the city $10.9 million. It's really important to note that that money was used to continue our general fund operations through police, fire, park and rec, public works, library, and it ultimately had a positive impact on our reserve position at the end of that fiscal year.
So almost 11 million is what was in there. And if you're going forward to fiscal year 24, which we are in, let's say ARPA didn't pass because it barely passed. It hadn't passed. Where would we be without that right now?
Councilmember Freeman, so in fiscal year 24, I just kind of eyeball here, the difference between our disaster reserve level of $26 million to where we're projected to end up at $36 million, we'd be at our disaster reserve level. That's correct. And so as you move forward into fiscal year 25 and fiscal year 26, we will be depleting, we would have been depleting our disaster reserves in those years.
So the ARPA is, when we're talking about our reserves over time, the ARPA is an anomaly that gives us some coverage for right now. But if we didn't have the ARPA and we had all the previous, what we went through the previous years, we would right now not have any contingency and we would be at our disaster reserves. Should something come up unexpected, we would be going into our disaster reserves.
Councilmember Freeman, that is correct.
Thank you. And just a couple more questions. You mentioned that going forward, we do have projected deficits. And as part of that, my recollection is that we have projected into our budgets going forward a 4% staff compensation increases going forward the next couple of years. With the class and comp studies that we're doing, let's say we go above and beyond that 4%, would that impact the reserves levels, and would that potentially increase those deficits?
Councilmember Freeman, that is correct. In our adopted budget, it assumes a 4% salary adjustment, which does include cost of living assumption adjustments, as well as other salary-related changes that might occur during the year. So if the actual salaries were higher than that assumption, it would do both. It would increase the projected deficit, which would require additional use of reserves in those years. That is correct.
Thank you. And then just a couple more. Going back to the police station bonding, you said that the bonding ratings are going to be looking at a number of different factors. And in and of itself, it's not going to say we changed the reserve policy, so we're going to lower it. But something you said actually was interesting to me was if they're going to be looking at the volatility of our revenues as well, among the other things. So being that we do have very volatile revenues, because in our county we're the most reliant on the hotel bed tax, would that be something they would look at in conjunction together, is a lower reserve plus the volatility? And so each on its own might not be, but all of a sudden they start putting them together. Would that be something that they would consider when they're looking at it?
Councilmember Freeman, yes, they would consider that. They would consider the source of the revenue for the city to make our required annual debt service payment. And the debt for the police facility is planned to be 100% funded by our Measure C, district sales tax, which is a sales tax revenue, which is volatile, more volatile than other revenue sources. But I will say we are planning for that and we are budgeting for it. And the amount of annual revenue we plan to get for Measure C is more than enough to cover, at the very least, the annual debt service payment. But it will come at a cost of programming other projects with that Measure C revenue source. So all that will be looked at.
And so for us, we want to come in with the strongest possible position to get the lowest interest rate. And if we even toggled it a small percentage, what would that mean?
Councilmember Freeman, I really can't say what the credit agency, what the rating agency will do if we were to toggle the reserve policy target from 25% to say 22%. It's really hard to know. It's one component of a larger analysis.
Okay, thank you. And then just if something were to, on the police station, were to end up and we had a slightly higher interest rate, what does that mean by having a slightly higher interest rate over time?
Councilmember Freeman, if the credit agency were to look unfavorably on a potential action to change the reserve policy, and that meant that it's more expensive for the city to issue debt for our police facility project, that will come in the form of a higher interest rate on that debt, which means our annual debt service payment that we will pay over the life of the issuance of that debt, probably 30 years, 20 to 30 years, will be greater. So it'll be a higher expense on an annual basis.
Okay. Thank you. And then just my last question. This was actually interesting at the Finance Committee. We had a good discussion on it. It was a line of credit and the potential use of a line of credit, which long-term it might be something that we want to look at. But could you just talk a little bit about that and what talk about a line of credit and how it would differ from what we're doing now?
Sure, Councilmember Freeman. So there are large public agencies that do have lines of credit. The city currently does not have one. What this would be, we would open up a line of credit with a banking institution that would allow us to access those funds, that capital, pretty much immediately in a time that we needed to. So let's say during the January storm, if we need access to $2 million immediately, if we had a line of credit open, we could immediately access those funds. So it could be thought of as a way of augmenting or potentially replacing the need to have as high of disaster reserves as we currently have, which would free up that cash for other purposes and other uses. Now, the line of credit does come at a cost, right? It's expensive to open up. There's a one-time setup fee, and then when we access that line, we have to pay interest on those funds over time. So it comes at a cost.
And we haven't done that analysis yet to make a decision on whether we want to pursue that.
Correct. Councilmember Freeman, we have not done that analysis. Staff did look into that a couple of years ago when we were looking into purchasing and then financing multiple fire apparatus. We went with a different financing vehicle at that time, but we did research it. We would go out again if council directed staff to go ahead and do the research and come back to you with the results of that to see if you want to proceed.
Okay. That's all I have for now. Thank you.
So Mr. DeMartini, so going back to Mr. Freeman's credit line question, there certainly are the upfront costs as well as the cost of interest at the back end of it. But also, I know in the private sector, wouldn't a substantial credit line also affect your credit rating, your bond rating, because it would be an obligation?
Mayor Rouse, that is correct. They would look at that as an additional obligation the city currently has to pay before we would have to pay on our annual debt service payments for the debt that we would be issuing at that time. So that is
Because it
correct.
would have
Could
priority,
impact.
right? We'd have to subordinate to that, right?
That's correct.
Okay. And then on the graph that you had before, I think it was maybe slide 9 or, is there anywhere in that history that you showed where we had an exotic form of financing coming in like we did that one time, ARPA? I don't remember any other time of getting some kind of a higher government bailout anywhere. That was unusual, was it not? Yeah, so
Mayor Rouse, there isn't a time in that
probably couldn't
administration.
plan on that for the future too much.
That is correct.
Okay, very good. All right, well, with that, we will go to, if there's no more questions, we'll go to public comment on this item. And I believe I have one speaker slip, and that would be for Zach Smith. Mr. Smith, you have 3 minutes. Ms. Gorman will tell you the time because our electronic timer hasn't been budgeted for, I guess, right? No, Mr. Smith.
Hello, Mayor and Council. I think you maybe have seen just yesterday it came out a study that Santa Barbara is the most expensive city to be happy in by like $20,000, by the way. And I'm facing this as an employee here every day. Childcare costs $2,000 a month. Housing costs, I got my rent raised 10% 2 consecutive years. My child is 14 months old and has had his rent raised on him 10% twice. That's $500, that $2,500 that I wasn't expecting. We are in disaster mode. Your employees are in disaster mode all the time. Yet the city has never significantly, at least, dipped into the disaster reserves. We've only gone into the contingency reserves, which is why they're there. I think doing nothing today, which it kind of sounds like is going to happen, would be a signal to your employees that you are not responding to our disaster, our crisis. And I think for anyone who's watching, I didn't plan on commenting today, but I think we need to understand that if this council is continually going to do nothing, not go into Measure C, fine. Not lower the disaster reserves, okay. How are we going to address our significant recruitment and retention issues when we have employees leaving for better scenarios? I'm about to get pushed out of the city. I'm, getting to the point of overdraft fees, balance transfer credit cards. If something doesn't budge, if you all don't budge, what's going to happen to the city? I mean, honestly, who's going to be left to shovel the sand? Are we going to ship people in from LA? We need to do something. And over and over again, we've told you that. And over again, you've said no. We're getting to a breaking point. I'm at a breaking point personally. So I hope that you do something here to reduce the burden on your staff. I know that the line's moving and everything, it doesn't really matter as long as you all have the same picture of
30
what's going on.
seconds.
And you all have different pictures of what's going on. So get the same picture of what's going on, and assist your employees who are in disaster mode daily while the city is not daily. Again, we haven't dipped into these disaster reserves very minimally over the course of fire, flood, mudslides, pandemic. So, please do something. Thank you.
Thank you. Do we have any speakers online?
No, Mr. Mayor.
Okay, then with that, it's back to council for comment. Ms. Harmon.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Well, I'm very happy, as I think a couple of our colleagues have acknowledged, that this item is before us, and I specifically want to thank you, Mr. DiMartini and your staff for first bringing this to finance and then bringing it here. I very much appreciate the seriousness with which you took this direction and allowing us to have a very fulsome conversation. So though, as I will come to explain, I disagree with your recommendation, I cannot thank you enough for really bringing this forward in a way that allowed us to, I think, learn a lot and have the conversation. I have to start, of course, by acknowledging the importance of careful, conservative financial planning. I believe, as I think we all believe, that we have to center that fundamental goal of protecting our city's residents and mitigating risk to them to the best of our ability. That's clear. That's paramount to what we do. But when I think about good policy, in particular good financial policy, there's this twin goal as well, a second aim that we have to acknowledge and address, and that's to serve our city's residents in the here and now as well. We have to set financial policy that protects this city, that protects it as best we can from disaster and downturns and all of these things that we've talked about, stuff that's out of our control, and policy that also balances what I see as our other obligation to provide a full complement of services to the community as well. I believe, and I think the evidence shows, the testimony shows today, that we haven't found that balance quite yet when it comes to our reserve policy. Even in the face of many unprecedented disasters since 2005, the 2008 economic collapse, the Thomas Fire and debris flow, the COVID disaster, and its corollary economic effects. Even with all of those events, which were extreme, as we all understand, we never used more than 1 or 2% of our disaster reserves. This means that at worst, when we're thinking about the worst disasters that our community has faced since 2005, we've always had, at a minimum, at least 8% remaining in our disaster reserve account. That is a big buffer. And don't get me wrong, buffers are good. We need buffers. I support having a buffer. But when we're faced year after year with budget cuts that make it impossible for our employees to live in the city that they serve, when we are faced with cutting services for our residents, services that our tax-paying residents expect and deserve, I don't believe that it's good fiscal policy to keep the same reserve policy just because it's what we've always done, when the evidence shows us the different allocation is sufficient to protect our community in the face of disaster. So what I'm saying today is let's keep our rainy day fund. Let's keep it, but let's right-size it so it reflects the actual, even the potential costs of disaster. We don't need to continue to fund to an artificial percentage that doesn't reflect our lived experience of disaster. And unfortunately, our community has a lot of lived experience with disaster. We cannot say that we don't know what it feels like to face disaster in this community. We have experience with it. Nor do I believe, I should say, that the allocation as it currently stands reflects the will of our city's residents to see our tax dollars invested back in the community. I understand that we are limited by state law where we can place these funds, but I don't think an investment account with state-mandated minimums is where the majority of our tax-paying residents would like to see our money spent on a day-after-day basis. So to that end, I believe strongly, and propose this at Finance Committee as well, that we reduce the disaster reserve fund by 5%. To me, this is good financial planning. This is still a conservative position. It's still prudent. This is still prepared. This gives us a better balance between planning for an unknown future and responding to the known needs of our city's residents in the here and now. Those are our twin obligations. I also just want to add very briefly, thank you for indulging me, that I've had this position for a long time. This is not a new position that I'm taking, but my belief in the necessity of making this change took on a new urgency during our budget hearing this past year. Year after year, I feel like we find ourselves in this position where we are dipping into our reserves or acknowledging that we're not going to fund our reserves up to the target because we want to get to yes on a budget. And while I know that one-time uses of reserve funds are an acceptable way to use those funds, it feels like we've started to override our stated reserve policy just in order to put together this budget every year. That's not prudent. That's not pragmatic financial planning. And I don't understand why we have a reserve policy target if we intend year after year to ignore it. Why do we have a policy that's set at this level if we're so flexible about it? If we don't intend to fully fund it, because year after year we want to get to yes on a budget, clearly we already see it as fungible. So let's revise the policy to reflect the reality in which we work. It's not only impractical, in my view, from a planning perspective, but it really leads to highly politicized outcomes every budget season if we don't actually have a reserve policy that has any connection to reality. It's all very ad hoc. It means that certain people, certain groups, certain interests with greater visibility, greater perceived power are more likely to get access to funding than those that don't enjoy that same relative position. It's not good governance, in my opinion. I also want to acknowledge Councilmember Jordan's point. You're absolutely right. Changing this reserve policy is not going to mean all of a sudden next year that we have this whole new pot of money that we're working with. I acknowledge that and understand it. But it does set us on the path to align our budget with our values and, importantly, with our obligations to the community. So I'll close just by saying, let's continue to be careful, prudent planners. Yes, absolutely. And let's also give ourselves a budget that's going to allow for the programs and services that our city's residents deserve and expect. And let's set ourselves up to budget in a fair, ethical, consistent manner that obviates the need for the kind of ad hoc toggling of the reserves that we do on a one-off basis every budget season. So I just can't say strongly enough how much I hope that you will consider making this change in the disaster reserves from 15% to 10%. I agree that I'm hearing from the questions there may not be an interest in doing so, so I would propose that you consider perhaps a pilot program. If making a permanent change is not something you're open to, let's make that change for 5 years and see how it goes. So with that, Mr. Mayor, I thank you for your indulgence. Look forward to hearing from our colleagues.
Ms. Sneddon.
Thank you, Mayor Rouse, and thank you also, Councilmember Harmon, for framing that clearly deeply felt and impassioned, really, viewpoint. I would say, you know, it's almost more bothersome to me that these are separated into contingency and disaster because I believe in disaster mode, we really haven't seen anything yet of what the potential of what we could face with climate change, fires, sea level rise. I don't even want to say the word earthquake, but there it is. Any one of these coupled with something else, I just don't see that the future likelihood of disaster is going to go down, and I don't see that it's going to level off. I just myself see more urgency in disaster reliefs. So contingencies, we've used contingencies, we've rebounded from contingencies, and thankfully we haven't used disaster funds, but I think that 3 months of operating budget in a compounding disaster such as an earthquake with fire or any of these, you know, COVID or the next pandemic with another compounding factor, I do believe that we can increase our revenues, and that has been my consistent messaging throughout with the projections through budget season. It's never been that I've questioned the projections of what we're spending. It's always been just that I have really strong belief in our ability to have more revenue. And if we don't have enough revenue to take care of our basic needs, then we need to figure out a way to generate more revenue. On the reserve target, when I'm looking at this, you know, there have been times when we've been right at what our targets are. It's not like we have decades of data showing that we're consistently operating below our reserve target, and that we're setting that as sort of a new policy that we're sort of half following and ignoring. I mean, there was COVID. Up until then, we were right on target. And then there was COVID, and I would just make the argument that we are still in recovery from COVID. We are still in disaster recovery. Things like downtown parking haven't come all the way back yet. We haven't been through full cycles yet. So my concern is that if we lower what that target is, that then we'll get comfortable being 10% below that new number and really going into what truly needs to be held for disaster. I'm in favor of keeping the policy as it is and to keep looking for revenue. We need to take that seriously. I think we can also look at how we are spending the reserves, and to both Councilmember Harmon's points and to public comment, I would like to recognize that we are in disaster. Our staff are in crisis. This isn't the first time that we've heard about not having enough revenue to pay for basic needs of our community, of our staff, of what we need to be doing as a city. I think we could do things like declare a genuine housing crisis and look at disaster contingencies for addressing that in some way. I don't think we need to change the policy. I think we may need to adjust on maybe a 5-year period of time or something like that, where we recognize we're still recovering and we set a more pragmatic, similar to recommendation 4, knowing that we would keep our policy at 25%, but over the next 3 years, 5 years, whatever we might see needing to recover, that we're recognizing that we're still in recovery from disaster mode for that period of time. I also think that the money above policy is maybe not being spent in the way we might all agree on, and that's what the budget cycle is for. And some of those inequities or bigger questions, I think, are more about how we're spending what we have above that. But I really feel that we're not, I don't feel we're justified in the assumption that we won't need the disaster funds. I think just how we spend it could be adjusted.
Mr. Friedman.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. First, I'd like to thank the Finance Department, Mr. DiMartini, and your staff. This is a spirited conversation, just like at Finance. As you can see, we actually didn't have a recommendation from Finance, and we just punted it up to Council because of all the issues that we're talking about today. And I want to thank Councilmember Harmon for leading that conversation, and comments from Councilmember Sneddon. So the first thing I'll say is when I look at this slide number 9 up here on the history of our reserves in that green, what comes to my mind is that song, Georgia on My Mind. And the reason is that we're even having this conversation is in 2020, the state of Georgia had 2 special elections for not 1, but 2 U.S. senators. And both of them, Democrats, got elected to the state of Georgia, which was unprecedented. And that changed the balance in the U.S. Senate to 50 in favor of the Democrats and President Joe Biden. And because of that, ARPA passed. If either one of those had flipped the other way, it's most likely that ARPA would not have passed, and we wouldn't have that green spot right there. And we would be having a completely different conversation because we wouldn't have any contingency reserves today. We'd be right at the disaster target, which gets to Councilmember Sneddon's point, and I agree with it, is we haven't had the double whammy of, I'm going to put in my own words, but the double whammy of 2 disasters right at the same time. We got a glimpse of what that could be like just a few weeks ago when the first tropical storm that was named to hit the region, Southern California, in approximately 80 years, an earthquake the same day. And imagine if that earthquake had been, instead of a 5.5, a 6.5, and we had the rains that they had down in Baja or even San Diego and LA on the same day. That's why those disaster reserves are so important. And in terms of looking forward to how we're going to compensate our city staff who are going to be on the front lines and have been and will continue to be on the front lines when we have those disasters. That's where we have to look at new sources of revenue. We're not going to be able to get to the compensation that we need to by adjusting the reserve policy. That is a one-time change versus an ongoing expense. And I just don't, for me, that green line that comes back to it is we need to control our own destiny and not have it taken out of our hands by national elections or other sources when we have tools and we have things we can do here. The other thing that gives me great concern is the police station. And that is going to be, if I understand it, one of, if not the most expensive public works project we will do in the city. And right when we're going out and getting all that information to get our rating, we want to come in with the strongest possible rating so that we have the lowest possible interest rate. Because even if that interest rate changes just slightly, it will cost us over the course of the 30 years that we're going to finance it, it will cost us a significant amount of money, possibly more than we would save from putting the reserves down, or it'd be very close. So we need to make sure we get that rate as low as possible by having the strongest possible rating there. And then there's also the unknown factors of downtown parking, which the general fund is on the hook for. Right now, State Street is in a state of transition and flux. And until we have a plan and we have a path forward, the amount of parking is going to continue to be not where we want it to be. And so that puts the general fund in a flux and uncertainty of will we have to fund that eventually. Because until we get State Street settled, that's when the parking rates are really going to go up. But that could be a few years out. So who knows what happens in the next couple of years. And then there's the other things with the other funds, the self-insurance fund, where we actually did have to, a couple years ago, take a loan from the general fund to pay for something that we couldn't fund out of the self-insurance fund. And that did come from the general fund, and it was a significant hit that was unexpected. So those are all things that we have to balance. And then we also, if we are going to be looking at new revenue sources, whether they're some type of revenue measures, we need to be able to say to the public that we have the discipline, we understand the challenges, and we are trying to make it work now and show them what we've done, where we've held the line, where we've positioned ourselves on the police station to get the lowest possible rate, and the future investments, and it still doesn't work. And then that gives the voters and the residents confidence in what we're doing up here. And I think toggling the reserve policy might actually hinder that if we go down that path in the near future. So right now I'd be supportive of yes to the Harbor Preservation Fund item B on this. And then I do think the recommendation number 4, I'm open to that. I'm open to leaving it as, but I like that because what it does is it keeps the 25% reserve. But what it does say is that over the next couple of years, we're expecting challenges. And so we are able to move within a couple percentage points to fund certain items. But we do have a plan to try to replenish it. And it doesn't actually wouldn't affect how they look at our ratings because we would still have the same policy. So I think it is a little more upfront and transparent, but I also think it's transparent too to say the 25 is the target and we're going to go to that. So I'm open to number 4 if others are as well. Thank you.
Mr. Jordan.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Pretty much ticked all my boxes there for me. Because I have a day job too, I sat up last week and noticed that the United States just passed $23 billion in catastrophe losses for the first time ever, and there's also 3 months left in the year. And that to me is, in addition to one of the last points you made about showing that you can look at this dispassionately and have stability in a messaging to help with your pursuits of additional revenues, but just the uncertainty of where we're going. It's pretty clear to me also that the point you made about you could have one, but why aren't you going to have 2? and 2 events stacked upon us at any of the time we looked at, mudslide and 1 other event, COVID and 1 other event, or just amplify the 2 events a couple weeks ago between rain and a earthquake that shut us off, combined with the volatility of all of our revenue relying upon either people visiting this town or people driving into work in this town. That would just be a catastrophe. You hit all my points pretty much. I support number 1 as the staff recommendation. I'm hesitant to even think about number 4 because looking at the next 3 fiscal years, we already have significant deficits, and I don't understand how you would play with the plan to then carve back 3% of reduced revenues over a period of time while already playing with the significant deficits that are looming in front of us the next 3 fiscal years. So we're already having trouble just doing it right now. So as things worsen over the next 3 to 5 years in terms of the expense line growing substantially higher than the revenue line, how do you begin to play with a plan to bring that all back together? Happy to hear what that looks like, number 4, but today I will support staff's recommendation of number 1.
Mr. Gutierrez.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Can we bring up the staff recommendation slide up, please? Thank you. The one before it, sorry. Yeah. Well, I want to thank my colleagues for stating their opinions about this. I'll keep it short. I agree mainly with Councilmember Harmon, and I totally understand your all's point about being prepared for the unforeseen. But I also have to acknowledge that we keep doing the same thing and expect different results, and I feel like each and every one of us was at some point had stated when we were running for this position that we were going to do things differently. So in my opinion, in order to achieve things that we currently do not have, we're going to have to do things that we've never done before. So I know it's difficult. I know it's easier said than done. But I do agree that something has to be done. And I feel like number 4 at this point in time is pretty reasonable for us to consider. Yeah, I know it's difficult, but that's the responsibility we decided to uphold when we took this office. And yeah, I'm willing to take that risk, and I'm willing to accept the responsibilities of the unforeseen consequences of it and also the benefits. That's my thoughts.
All right, very good. Mr. DeMartini, would you go back to slide 9, please? So just to the left of fiscal year '05 is when we were having good times, good revenues were good. Council was pretty generous at the bargaining table, and then the Great Recession hit. And I came in office about fiscal year '11, and we spent those first 2 terms being real jerks in the bargaining room because we had to show fiscal responsibility. It wasn't much fun, but we got there and we topped out the reserves, which thank goodness we did, because all of a sudden we had these next set of disasters coming through. Now, 25% represents a quarter of the year. I mean, that's just logic. And you see the other communities that have their percentages up there, and they all kind of relate to something. I'm not sure what 22% really relates to or means. And I think that even if you look at recommendation number 4, we're trying to get this kind of, loose about how that works. It's kind of what we did this last year anyway. We've done that, but we still have the goal of going forth with getting back to 25. We have to have a plan to do that. And I'm not sure why we would want to change that wording, why we would want to change that reserve. We don't intended to go into reserves every year. We will the next couple of years if projections hold up to be the same. But I don't think by moving the goalposts, we're going to help ourselves nor serve our constituents. What's really important, what we really play fast and loose with sometimes is the public confidence. And public confidence means, do you have fiscal responsibility? The public generally assumes that we don't. And that's unfortunate, but this wouldn't help that at all. And having a good bond rating and a good ability to borrow money at reasonable rates is going to be huge going into this biggest project we've ever done as a city, which is going to be the police station. So that's really important. And in terms of the disaster reserves, one of the hallmarks of this city has been careful planning in all aspects. And when we've had our disasters, and I've talked to news agencies from all over the country to ask us how we did, and we did just fine. We did just fine because of our response, because of our planning, because of the teamwork going in, and that's how we've always done stuff. That's why we haven't blown into a lot of disaster reserves, because we really kind of planned for all that. And the way we responded was really key to preserving those funds. We had them if we needed them, but fortunately, we didn't have to go into them, not much. But we have gone through our contingency reserves in recent history. We've done so with a series of disasters which seem to be kind of frequent these days. And I'm not trying to predict anything, but I think our careful planning on doing that has really kind of saved our bacon in a lot of ways. And there's a lot of communities that envy our bond rating. In some big communities, places like Chicago, which is in the tank as far as our bond rating goes, we have done well by showing fiscal discipline and restraint going forward. I think it's also, we have such a volatile economy because we're primarily hospitality. So when times are good, we're great. When times are bad, we go down like a rock, which happened during COVID. We suffered a lot more than neighboring communities because we are primarily hospitality. So, and now we had this nice big bump directly after COVID, but now we're seeing the softening again, which is not unusual just post-Labor Day, but also you're seeing room rates and whatnot, and they're starting to soften quite a bit because it did get kind of out of whack. So what's going to happen? Because inflation is still up there. Insurance rates, Mr. Jordan talked about the losses all over the country. That's a huge deal, plus the fact that commercial real estate has gone down by 16 to 18% across the country, which is really where big insurers make their money. So that's going to, in fact, affect what we pay in insurance rates. That has to be considered. Our pension obligations, even though we showed discipline this year by creating a pension trust fund 115, part of reserves, to try to pay down some pension obligations, we still are way away from target, and that target's not getting any closer. I mean, that's just a reality all agencies are facing. So when we go into these things and we try to borrow from the piggy bank that we have, try to reduce our fiscal responsibility, our outward statement of conservancy, I think we're making a big mistake. I think we're saying we're not serious. I think we're saying that as a community, we were just kidding all these years, but we're not. I think what we've done is important. I think what we should do is maintain what we have going forward. I agree with item 1 about doing the, and I think Mr. Wilshire does as well, we're agreeing with what to do with the harbor reserve balance. For the rest of it, I would say we need to stay with status quo. We've shown some flexibility. We had to break into reserves. We have to have a plan to get those back. I think that's good planning. I think that's the way we should run our household. So I'll be supporting staff recommendation as it pertains to the harbor thing, but the rest of it, I would like to remain status quo. And with that, unless anybody else has another comment, I would entertain Ms. Sneddon.
Thank you, Mayor Rouse. I'll move recommendation 1.
Okay, recommendation 1 has been firsted by Councilmember Sneddon and seconded by Mr. Jordan. Any discussion on the motion? May we have a vote? Madam Clerk.
Yes, this is a motion by Councilmember Sneddon, seconded by Councilmember Jordan for recommendation 1, which I'm going to read into the record. And that is recommendation that the City Council adopt an ordinance amending the Santa Barbara Municipal Code by repealing Chapter 17.40, transfer funds in the Harbor Preservation Fund into the Waterfront Capital Fund.
All right, very good.
And Councilmember Friedman.
Yes.
Councilmember Oscar Gutierrez.
Yes.
Councilmember Snedden.
Yes.
Councilmember Jordan.
Yes.
Councilmember Harmon, sorry.
Yes.
And Mayor Rouse.
Aye. All right, very good. Now, do we need to respond to each of those other recommendations then, or we can call that the item then? Very good. Thank you very much for the discussion. With that, we'll move into our next item.
Excuse me, Mr. Mayor, there's another recommendation from staff, and that would be the ordinance.
Aha,
Are
I was
you-
looking at the sheet up there. We got,
Okay. Could,
So,
uh,
you're talking about B?
introduce the ordinance, staff recommendations?
Wasn't that encapsulated in one, or do we need
No.
to? Okay. All right then, Madam Clerk, would you, no, let me go ahead and ask then for a motion, then on item B. Moved by Snedden, second by Jordan. Question? Okay. Very good. Everybody understand the motion? And then, when you're ready, Madam Clerk will take the roll.
Very good. One moment here. Okay, this is a motion by Councilmember Snedden, seconded by Councilmember Jordan, for staff recommendation B, which is to introduce and subsequently adopt by reading of title only an ordinance of the Council of the City of Santa Barbara amending the Santa Barbara Municipal Code by repealing Chapter 17.40 pertaining to the purpose, accumulation, and use of funds within the Harbor Preservation Fund.
Thank you.
Okay.
And have a roll call vote, please.
Very good. And the vote for that, Councilmember Oscar Gutierrez.
Yes.
Councilmember Snedden?
Yes.
Councilmember Jordan?
Yes.
Councilmember Harmon?
Yes.
Councilmember Friedman?
Yes.
And Mayor Rouse.
All right.
And that was a yes?
Yes.
Very good. And that's unanimous with Mayor Pro Tem Alejandro Gutierrez absent. Thank you.
Right. All right, very good. Move on to the next item.
Next item is item 16, appointment to the Fire and Police Commission.
All right, we have Mr. Lopez to run our show here.
Mr. Mayor, members of the City Council, we have one vacancy on the Fire and Police Commission and 10 qualified applicants, so we can go ahead and take nominations from each of you, and then we'll have a roll call vote to fill that one vacancy.
All right, so we'll call for nominations. I guess, should we go right down the line? Would that be the best way to? Okay, Ms. Snedden, go ahead.
Nominate Aaron Edward Jones.
Okay. And then, Mr. Jordan?
Nominate Klein.
Okay. Anyone else care to chime in? I'm going to nominate Burns. Anybody else? So we have the three candidates, Burns, Klein, and Jones. So I suppose then we will go through and vote.
Very good. So, Mr. Mayor and Council, I will list the name of each council member, and they can state which person they are casting their vote for. And the nominees are Jones, Klein, and Burns. I'm sorry?
Just a quick question. Do we need to open public comment because this is an item before we vote on it?
Do we do that on a committee vote like that?
I just want to be
Madam,
sure
Yeah.
before we take a vote on this.
So I'll ask the city attorney.
Mr. Mayor, typically you don't take public
That's
comment
right,
on
thanks.
this.
I just wanted to be sure because we're voting on an item and usually we have public comment. Thank you.
And there's no
One in
hands
every
raised.
crowd. All right, very good. Madam Clerk, if you'd continue, please.
Very good. Nominees are Jones, Klein, and Burns. Councilmember Snedden.
Jones.
Councilmember Jordan.
Klein.
Councilmember Harmon.
Jones.
Councilmember Friedman.
Jones?
Councilmember Oscar Gutierrez.
Jones?
Mayor Russ.
Burns.
Mr. Jones is appointed.
All right, very good. Thank you very much. No, Mr. Jones is here, but, all right, very good. We will move then to item 7. Do we need a break, Madam Mayor? Madam, whatever
Mayor,
you
I think that this is a good time to take a brief break, as I expect the next item will take quite some time.
Sometimes said, okay, very good. Let's reconvene right at 4 o'clock, please. reconvene. And Madam Clerk, if you could read the item, please.
Certainly. Item 17, appeal of the Planning Commission's approval of a coastal development permit at 125 and 145 South Calle Cesar Chavez and 110 and 114 South Quarantina Street.
All right, very good. So this is a quasi-judicial, can never say that, procedure. And so I'm going to ask any council members if they have any ex parte communications regarding this matter. Mr. Jordan.
The answer to that question is no, but I did want to say that I did not attend the, if there was a group site visit yesterday. I went by Friday on my own, viewed the sites, walked a little bit around the neighborhood, so I have familiarized myself with the sites.
Very good. Mr. Gutierrez.
I attempted to attend the site visit, but I ended up at the wrong address. But I was able to run into a Marburg employee who gave me a rundown of the situation.
Very good. Ms. Sneddon.
Thank you. I attended what would have been the site visit if there'd been a quorum, and so we're reporting it as ex parte communication, and it was a very brief, just sort of visual survey of the scene.
Very good. Ms. Harmon.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Similar to Mr. Jordan, I did not attend the sanctioned or official site visit. I did go by the site on my own, and I did not speak to anyone involved in this item while I went by.
All right, very good. And I as well went to the non-presentation presentation. I did speak at some short length with the Marburg staff at the site. All right then. So we're going to start out with a staff presentation, and then we'll move into the appellant presentation, and that'll be limited to 20 minutes in length. It does not need to be expended all at one shot. You can take and reserve time. We will track time that you have reserved for your, in case you want to have some time for rebuttal. That'll be followed by the presentation by the applicant. Once again, 20 minutes. Same rules. You may reserve time if you so need. And then city staff has 10 minutes after that to respond to anything that comes up, any other issues. And after that, we'll have comments from people who are not part of either party but wish to comment on the item. And then I'll come back to council after that. All right, with that, we will, oh, Ms. Harmon, you have a question? All right, with that, we will begin with the staff presentation. Mr. Baumann.
All right. Good afternoon, Mayor Rouse, hello, council members. This is the appeal of the Marburg project. Staff's recommendation today is for the council to deny the appeal and uphold the Planning Commission's approval of the coastal development permit and their determination of a California Environmental Quality Act CEQA exemption, making the required findings in the Planning Commission's resolution 005-23, and also direct staff to return to the City Council with a decision and findings resolution reflecting the outcome of the appeal. The project involves a new concrete storage yard for Marburg Industries. The site's currently used as a storage yard, but this would kind of formalize it and clean it up and do a paved storage yard. The project includes replacing an existing parking lot for the Path Shelter. They're on Cacique Street, and way back when the city owned the property, they provided off-site parking for the Path Shelter. So Marburg's continuing with that commitment to provide the parking. The project would remove the existing trees in the middle of the site and install new trees around the perimeter. That would accomplish a couple of things. It would get rid of the trees that are in the way of the proposed storage yard. They're mostly mature eucalyptus trees. And then the replacement trees would be around the perimeter of the site to screen the site from the two street frontages and also from the railroad right-of-way. Project includes new fencing and landscaping, again with the purpose of screening the storage yard. It would restore a small drainage / wetland. It's in pretty degraded shape. It's almost wetland creation rather than restoration, but it'll improve that drainage. And that also involves soil remediation in that area of the site and habitat restoration and monitoring for future success of the restoration plantings that would be installed. The project proposes 2 stormwater bioretention basins to treat the runoff from the new paved surface, and includes grading of approximately 2,500 cubic yards of dirt to be exported and 120 yards of fill. That's a lot of grading. The site's pretty flat, and it would remain flat. There might be a little bit of contouring to slope the concrete pad for drainage so it doesn't have puddles, et cetera. But the export of that amount of dirt would really be replaced roughly approximately about the same amount of concrete brought in to do the concrete slab. So no real grade change per se. The project, this is a vicinity map. It's just north of the railroad tracks. It's 4 lots that comprise the site. It has frontages on both Calle Cesar Chavez and South Quarantina Street. It's in the industrial area of the city's coastal zone. This is an aerial view, closer view of the project site. There's the railroad track to the south, the 2 street frontages. Up in that upper right-hand part of the site, you can see the existing parking lot. And in the middle of the site, the dark green areas, you can see a kind of a row of big eucalyptus trees running across the property, and then some more trees along the railroad, and a clump of trees in that wetland area down in the south west corner of the site. The project's in both the appealable and non-appealable jurisdictions of the coastal zone. The appealable's down there in yellow. The reason that's appealable jurisdiction is because of that wetland. That's kind of part of what defines the appealable jurisdiction. That's significant for this project because the work in that area requires the coastal development permit. And it also makes the Planning Commission the review authority for the coastal development permit. And we'll describe more about the soil remediation, but the project's already done soil remediation on 3 of those 4 lots. More or less they're in the green areas of the site. But it needs the coastal development permit to do the cleanup in the appealable jurisdiction. So that results in some amendments to the soil cleanup plans that they've been working on with county environmental health. We've been coordinating with county environmental health to make sure that their scope of work that they need to perform is in sync with the city's coastal development permit to allow that work to proceed. This is a proposed site plan. You can see that stippled color. That's all just a vast concrete slab that would be put there. And then down to the kind of the lower right side, you can see a row of all the parking spaces lined up in a row along the railroad track. That's where the path parking is proposed to be located. There's one existing driveway coming off South Quarantina now. That would be divided into 2 driveway entrances, one coming into the Marburg storage yard. You can kind of see that wider driveway entrance over at the far right. And then the narrower driveway that would just go into the path parking area. There'd be a fence between the parking area and the storage yard. That would be the only access into the storage yard. There wouldn't be access for Marburg on Calle Cesar Chavez. Over in that far corner to the left is one of the bioretention basins where the site's currently accessed. In its configuration today, that's kind of where the trucks come in and out, is over toward that side of the site. And then the wetland area would be restored and also used for biofiltration to treat the stormwater, which makes sense because the water naturally drains toward the wetland area. And the coastal policies, well, there's a buffer around the wetland area required by a coastal policy, but there's a policy that allows the degree of biofiltration in that buffer, and that's what the project's proposing. The landscape plan is a large project component. For one thing, the trees that are removed would be pretty well balanced with new trees to be installed in terms of amount of tree canopy before and after. The ABR looked at this and really pressed them for more perimeter landscaping. So they're adding new trees along the railroad corridor. The ABR was concerned that the view from the railroad be considered carefully as kind of a gateway to the city for people arriving on the train, and also perhaps from the hotel view on the other side of the railroad tracks. And also pressed them to do some nice landscaping and screening along South Quarantina Street. So the project would dedicate a strip of land along South Quarantina Street to move their fence inward and provide, there's an existing chain link fence there. That would be moved inward with a nicer, taller fence and a new sidewalk and planter strip to comply with the pedestrian master plan. Also, the project initially proposed to take out the street trees on South Quarantina because they were kind of not in a line where they would normally be for a street frontage, but the ABR really felt like they should keep them, so that's why they've designed the sidewalk the way they did there. This is a drawing of that landscape frontage on South Quarantina, where the existing street trees are the trees shown there, and then there would be an 8-foot fence with planting on it to screen it, and then a landscape planter between the trees. There's no landscaping shown on that section where there's a metal picket fence. That's because of the driveway entries, or really the driveway exits, so that the vehicles exiting through the gates could see pedestrians coming and going. So they weren't allowed to screen that, but they did use a nice quality fence there. The picture to the right with the lower left with the car, that shows a section view of how the parking would be treated for the path shelter, that row of cars that face in toward the railroad right away. So that side would have a chain link fence along the railroad, but it would be screened with planting. And then a section view of the way the new sidewalk would be constructed. This is a picture of the existing situation with the street trees at Quarantina Street. You can see the chain link fence is pretty close right behind the trees, and they would move that back to make more, with the new fence, they would dedicate a public easement and move the fence back to provide room for the sidewalk there. So the required application for the project is a coastal development permit. And also, the Planning Commission made a determination of a CEQA categorical exemption as an infill development project. So now getting to address the appellant's issues. That one issue area, I guess you could say, is public coastal access. The concern is that the project's not consistent with coastal policies and will negatively impact public access to the coast, and that other Marburg operations in the area have a cumulative negative impact on public coastal access due to Marburg employees parking in the area, and also that relevant coastal policies were not considered in the staff report or by the Planning Commission. So staff's response to these issues are that the scope of this coastal development permit is limited to the subject site. We didn't examine other Marburg operations or other Marburg projects, just limited to this piece of property. An open industrial storage yard with no building floor area has no zoning ordinance requirement for parking. And in that sense, this is a really unusual project. We rarely see a project that doesn't involve a building of some sort or a parking requirement. And that may have caused some confusion. The appellant included a discussion of Assembly Bill 2097, which allows projects within a half mile, in this case of the Santa Barbara train station, to be exempt from parking requirements. But in this case, like I said, this is an unusual project, and it didn't have a parking requirement per the zoning ordinance, and it's not in the proximity for AB 2097. This is about two-thirds of a mile from the train station. where AB 2097 is not applicable. The most relevant coastal policy pertaining to parking is Policy 3.1-29, and that states that parking standards in the zoning ordinance are designed to ensure sufficient off-street parking is provided. And that's the policy that we use all the time for any kind of coastal development permit projects that involve parking and meeting parking requirements. And really, when a project proposes to meet its parking requirement in the ordinance, we kind of say, well, that's enough said. You're consistent with coastal policy regarding parking. And because the project didn't have a parking requirement, we just found, staff just considered it to be consistent with Policy 3.1-29. And we didn't discuss this policy in the Planning Commission staff report, but it is relevant, if only to bring it up to say what we just said, that this particular project doesn't have a parking requirement, so it's consistent with that policy. There are a few other policies cited by the appellant that are intended to guide city planning efforts and programs, and they're listed that way in the city's coastal land use program. They're called out as either city planning and efforts and programs policies or development review policies. And some of these listed here pertain to city planning efforts. And for example, parking supply and management, that's not something that a project could respond to. These are bigger picture policies that pertain to city policies and programs. Policy 3.1-21, and it's also repeated as Coastal Act 30211, public access and development. Says that development shall not interfere with the public's right of access to the sea. And the fuller text of this policy, it's mainly relevant to properties that are right on the coast, oceanfront properties. It's not really relevant to this site because there's no right of access here. And policy 3.1-23, mitigation required for traffic impacts. When a project causes a project-specific significant adverse traffic impact affecting public access to the shore, mitigation is required. Our city's public works transportation planning staff looked at this and found that the project would not impact traffic because it would facilitate a more efficient operation for Marburg and doesn't result in an expansion of existing uses. Policy 3.1-26, new development and sustainable transportation. It's also a Coastal Act policy. Requires projects to minimize energy consumption and vehicles miles traveled. And this project does very good in that regard because it's located right in the city. It would allow the storage and retrieval from the storage yard near Marburg's operations, thereby minimizing energy consumption and vehicle miles traveled for Marburg's traffic. Coastal Act Section 30252 states location and amount of new development should maintain and enhance public access to the coast. There again, this project doesn't really have anything to do with that one way or the other. The proposed equipment storage yard wouldn't impact access to the coast. And then I'll call it appeal area, or appeal issue area number 2, the soil remediation environmental review. The Planning Commission's determination of an environmental exemption did not include additional corrective actions for soil remediation required by the county environmental health services. And the soils corrective action plan should have been included as a condition of approval to approve the CEQA exemption. Well, the soils corrective action plan was in the project description, so we considered that to be within the scope of the CDP. Like I described, I worked carefully with the EHS staff EHS staff to coordinate that because we wanted the soil sampling and et cetera that EHS needs to do to move forward to be included in the coastal development permit approval. But we wanted to leave a little bit of flexibility in the coastal development permit approval in case the sampling determined different quantities of remediation might be required. The contaminated soils will be disposed of in accordance with the EHS approved soils management plan. Oh, on the previous slide, the Planning Commission did in fact add they added one condition of approval when they approved the CDP, and that was to do the soils management plan. So that's in the Planning Commission resolution. And I just talked about how the CDP includes the soil remediation under EHS supervision. So staff determined and the Planning Commission concurred that the project is exempt from further environmental review per CEQA section 15332, which is infill development. That means infill development project is by definition a project that's consistent with general plan and zoning. The site's not larger than 5 acres. It's surrounded by urban uses. No habitat value for endangered, rare, or threatened species. That was confirmed in biological reports for the project. Would not result in significant effects to traffic, noise, air quality, water quality, and the site is served by required utilities and public services. So given all that, the project does meet the definition of infill development. And also, when you use a CEQA exemption, you have to be sure there are no exceptions that wouldn't allow the exemption. And those are that the project's not located in an area where it may impact environmental resources of hazardous or critical concern. There's no cumulative impact of successive projects, no significant effect due to unusual circumstances, not damaged scenic resources, not a listed hazardous waste site, and no historic resources. The project does have contamination, and mostly in the form of lead in the soil, but it's not a listed hazardous waste site. It's a known open cleanup site. The findings to approve the coastal development permit are that the project is consistent with the policies of the Coastal Act and the city's coastal land use plan. I just provided responses to some of the appellant's appeal issues that many were not exactly relevant or not applicable to the project, but the city council does need to consider all the policies that are applicable in order to make a decision on the appeal and the coastal development permit. So the Coastal Act policies that we had pointed out to the Planning Commission that were most relevant were the ones regarding scenic and visual qualities. That's where the ABR comes in to ensure good screening for this industrial storage use. So the ABR paid a lot of attention to the landscaping and the fencing, et cetera. Policy regarding minimization of adverse impacts, for example, energy consumption and vehicle miles traveled, consistent with APCD requirements. The project does all that. Air Pollution Control District also provided staff with recommendations that we had included already in the draft conditions of approval that were approved by the Planning Commission. So those do incorporate Air Pollution Control District recommendations. This is another list of relevant pertinent policies. Restore and enhance visual degraded areas. The project doesn't involve a lot of change in terms of its use. It would have a more, I guess, neater, tidier paved storage yard instead of the dirt operation that's there now. It would enhance the visual appearance of the site with the new perimeter screening. I talked about the ABR, same thing. Compatible development, usually when we're looking at this policy, we're looking at buildings, and do they fit into the neighborhood, or in terms of size, bulk, and scale? But here we just have a flat concrete storage yard, but it is compatible with the industrial neighborhood that it's located in. Landscape plans, we talked about that. The ABR's looking at that. The project will return to ABR for a design review approval if the coastal development permit's approved. Screened parking facilities, tree protection and replacement, development within the habitat buffer area. I touched on that. The only development is part of the bioretention that's allowed per a specific coastal policy. Bird breeding and nesting, the trees that are proposed to remove, there's a condition that talks about not removing them during nesting season, or if they are proposed to be removed during that time, that a nesting survey be done. There was a nesting survey already done and a biological evaluation of those trees during application review. So staff's recommendation, to repeat it again, deny the appeal and uphold the Planning Commission's approval of the coastal development permit and their determination of the CEQA exemption, making the required Coastal Act and Coastal LUP findings in the Planning Commission resolution, and direct staff to return back to council with a decision and findings resolution. So that concludes my presentation.
All right, very good. And with that, Madam Clerk, is the appellant ready? I believe she's online, if I'm not, okay?
Appellant Gott, can you go ahead and speak? Let's see.
You have 20 minutes, and Ms. Gorman will track your time, and she'll tell you what you have reserved.
Yes, and Ms. Gott, can you unmute yourself? And if you are a call-in user, I'm going to unmute that also. So Ms. Gott, please go ahead and speak. I won't start your timer yet. I want to make sure I can hear you first.
Yeah. Can you hear me now?
Yes, okay, hold one moment.
Well, one second. We have some housekeeping to take care of.
Ms. Gott, please hold tight 1 moment.
Campaign finance laws that came into effect this year.
Ms. Gott, please hold. I'm just getting your PowerPoint set up. Hold tight for 1 moment. Okay, Ms. Gott, I'm going to go ahead and start the timer.
Excuse me, can you hear me?
Yes. Yes,
Hello?
we can hear you.
Before we start the timer, I had sent some information to Ms. Gorman. It was Councilmember Jordan's campaign statement from last year that shows that he received $2,500 from Marburg less than a year ago. And as you know, on January 1st, a new pay-for-play campaign finance law was put into effect. Unless he has returned that money to Marburg before today, I would like to have him recused, because the maximum amount of money that he would be able to have received in the last year is $250, and he received $2,500. Additionally, I'd like to receive confirmation from the other council members that they have not received any campaign contributions between July 1st of this year and today for the majority of council members. And from Oscar Gutierrez, he has not submitted any campaign finance disclosures, and so I have no visibility to even know if he's received any money in the last year.
Mr. Mayor, I would just like to comment on that. So the changes to the Levine Act that came into effect this year do not apply to campaign contributions made prior to January 1st, 2023.
All right, very good. So that clarifies that. Would you go, Mr. Gutierrez, you have a comment?
Okay.
Just to address her question, I have yet to start a campaign finance
Right.
campaign, so.
So I think Ms. Gorman cleared, or Ms. Connect cleared that up. So with that, Ms. Gott, why don't you go ahead and with your presentation, please?
Good afternoon, Mayor and council members. This is if we can put my PowerPoint actually online, I don't see it. Hello?
Ms.
We
Gott,
can
we
see
do
your
see it in
PowerPoint, Ms.
we
Gott.
see it in chambers.
Okay. I guess when I'm speaking, I can't see it. Okay. Good afternoon, Mayor and council members. This is a satellite image of the project site taken in the last few years, with most, but not all of, Marburg Industries operations in the coastal zone. Between 1 and 2 acres of Marburg's operations in the coastal zone is not shown in this image. None of Marburg Industries operations provide a single parking space for their employees. Next slide.
Ms. Gott,
You know, I can't see anything. Can you tell me when you have the next slide?
yes,
Up?
yes, it is advanced.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon, sorry. Let's look at the cumulative impacts of Marburg Industries in this area of the coastal zone. Next slide.
Advanced.
For this first, this project is not exempt. The cumulative impacts of successive development is material to this project, and it must be addressed. Marburg Industries has sought to develop this entire area shown previously while they evade the requirement of an environmental impact report by applying for separate approvals for various projects in the area. Staff is framing this as a 2.41 acre development. Instead, you must be looking at this as a 9.59 acre development. These properties are all owned or leased by the Marburg family of owners or Marburg Industries. And these properties are primarily used by Marburg Industries for their operations. Next slide.
Advanced.
This comes directly from the Coastal Commission memo AB 2097. Section 30211, Public Access and Development, states that new development in the coastal zone shall not interfere with the public's right of access to the sea, including in terms of parking, and must be located within or near existing developed areas able to accommodate it, or other areas with adequate public services where it will not have significant adverse effects, either individually or cumulatively, on coastal resources, including public access and recreation as required under Section 30250 of the Coastal Act. Next slide, please.
Advanced.
The Coastal Commission defines cumulative impacts as the combined effects of a series of development activities within a particular region or ecosystem. Although an individual project may not greatly affect the natural or human environment, the cumulative impacts created by many different projects over time may significantly alter these environments. This project fully meets the criteria and the definition that the Coastal Commission developed for cumulative impact. Next slide, please.
Advanced.
These images illustrate that the nearby streets are fully parked before most businesses in the area are even open. In 2017, Sharon Byrne conducted a parking study for the tenants of Railroad Square. She found that the majority of on-street parking was used by Marburg employees before 7 a.m. This area has in excess of 100 parking spaces. Next slide.
Advanced.
Now let's look at the evidence for cumulative impact. Next slide.
Advanced.
Here is the list of Marburg Industries projects within the area and their status. Now let's look at the operations of these properties that you would have missed during your site visit because Marburg Industries' fleet of vehicles were off-site during normal business hours. Next slide.
Advanced.
This photo shows a few of Marburg Industries' fleet of garbage trucks occupying the project site. Employees park their personal vehicles in the street Monday through Friday, while the parking spaces for garbage trucks they operate sits empty. Let's pretend that the project will simply be a storage lot. Where will these garbage trucks be parked if this project is approved? Won't they be parked on the properties adjacent to this project or on the project site itself that is going to be basically concrete? Isn't that cumulative development, and isn't that related to this project? In general, it's safe to say that if it looks like a duck and quacks like a duck, it's probably a duck. So no matter how you slice it, these vehicles will be parked on the project site or an adjacent property, and that is cumulative development. The employees of Marburg Industries that operate these commercial vehicles are all parking their personal vehicles on the street when they could be parking their vehicles in the parking places of these garbage trucks or other vehicles that are going to be stored on this property. Next slide.
Advanced.
What is not shown in this photo are big rigs and garbage trucks that are stored on-site and driven off-site daily. This, oh, by the way, is the portion of the project within the appealable jurisdiction, and this is exactly where the wetland is, and that Marburg has degraded. Next slide, please.
Advanced.
This empty cement pad is what you saw during your site visit. This parking lot could become a shared parking lot where Marburg Industry employees could park instead of the street. Next slide.
Advanced.
The unpermitted cement pad seen here encroaches into the public right-of-way, which means a sidewalk cannot be built. The two projects that Marburg Industries have on South Quarantina dead end to this space. There is nowhere to walk except in the street because of Marburg's unpermitted cement pad. Next slide, please.
Advanced.
The cement pad seen previously acts as a parking lot for over 50 garbage trucks. The employees, again, who operate these garbage trucks, park in the nearby streets during the day while this lot remains empty throughout the day. Next slide, please.
Advanced.
A sea of porta potties are parked at this location. The application for a new headquarters at this location is in the works. Parking for these employees will be provided on site, while employees that operate the garbage trucks, the big rigs, and other service vehicles will continue to park in the street without a change that you should be requiring today. Next slide.
Advanced.
More than half a dozen vehicles are parked at this location after hours. Unfortunately, This area cannot be used during the day for parking, unlike other areas that Marburg has throughout this 9.59 acres. Why? Because they operate heavy equipment at this location. Next slide.
Advanced.
This operation does not have parking for employees who operate cement mixers that are shown or the other vehicles that are off-site. Next slide.
Advanced.
This is an unpermitted cement crushing operation, which also has no parking for its operations or employees. Next slide.
Advanced.
Newsflash. The state has usurped local control over parking with Assembly Bill 2097. Next slide.
Advanced.
The Santa Barbara County Association of Governments approved the county's regional transportation plan in 2017. This plan is related to Section 4 of Assembly Bill 2097. City staff only analyzed AB 2097 as it relates to Section 1, Section 2, and Section 3. But if you see at the end of Section 3, it says or, not an and, or a major transit stop identified in the applicable regional transportation plan. Well, in Section 4, there is no requirement that 2 or more bus routes connect with a frequency of 15 minutes or less. There's also no requirement that it be within half a mile of a bus or transit rail system, a rail system. Instead, the regional transportation plan simply needs to identify Line 2, East Santa Barbara's MTD bus route, as a major traffic stop or a planned major transit stop. The regional transportation plan has done this. That means that this project and many others that you're not even aware of are actually within 1/2 mile of a transit stop. Next slide.
Advanced.
The Regional Transportation Plan approved by SBCAG in 2017 specifically states that a significant portion of the south coast of Santa Barbara meets the necessary requirements to qualify as a transit priority area. A transit priority area is defined as an area within 1/2 mile of all major transit stops that are existing or planned. It then goes on to identify the transit priority areas in Figure 3. Next slide.
Advanced.
In Figure 3-3, you can specifically see the qualifying transit routes and stops in blue. They run from Santa Barbara all the way through Goleta. Line 2, East Santa Barbara, which runs up Milka Street, is clearly shown in blue. That means AB 2097 applies to this project. Next slide.
Advanced, and about 5 minutes and 30 seconds left.
Thank you. Under AB 2097, the city can impose other types of conditions to ensure that projects are consistent with the local coastal plan and public access and recreation policies of the Coastal Act and the certified local coastal plan. Next slide.
Advanced.
For instance, Plan Policy 3.1-29 of the local implementation plan for the city's local coastal, certified local coastal plan states that the parking standards in the zoning ordinance are designed to ensure sufficient off-street parking is provided. We know that Marburg Industries provides no parking for any of their employees throughout this entire project area. We also know that on-street parking in this area is used almost entirely by Marburg Industry employees, and this clearly represents the cumulative development impacts that this company has had in this area. So to reduce the vehicle miles traveled for Marburg employees, you know, that work in this area and park on the street, and to ensure that Marburg is doing the right thing, the council should include additional conditions of approval related to parking. You could say that it would be entirely reasonable to require conditions of approval for this project to include any of the following: that Marburg Industries share its designated garbage truck or other employee-driven vehicles parking areas with its employees, that Marburg Industries share its designated big rig parking areas with employees, and that Marburg Industry reimburse employees who use alternate transportation. Next slide.
Advanced.
An alternate transportation plan could and should include bus or bike share passes, car or van pool services, or the issuance of e-bikes, which the company would be responsible for annually. Perhaps the city council could target an alternate transportation solution that would move 50 or more vehicles off of the public street to shared parking lot, or ensure that the number of employees who use car or van pool services or e-bikes supplied by Marburg Industries. Next slide.
Advanced.
Next slide.
Advanced.
In section B, the recorded conditions agreement of the approved development simply states soil monitoring and remediation will be under the supervision of Santa Barbara County Public Health Department Environmental Services. You know what, due to the level of detail and the requirements, as well as the heavy toxins involved with this site, the corrective action plan should be in the recorded conditions agreement in order to approve the CEQA exemption. Instead, there's just a reference under the soil management plan for Marburg Industries to complete the soil management plan and corrective action plan addendum, which has already been done, and to receive approval from EHS. This really doesn't seem sufficient, and it really should be, as I said, in the recorded conditions agreement. Next slide.
And Ms. Gott, 1 minute, 40 seconds left, and advanced.
Okay. Please uphold this appeal and find that the project is subject to AB 2097, that the cumulative impacts of successive development as defined by the Coastal Commission by Marburg Industries in this area require you to impose additional conditions of approval to mitigate the on-street parking impacts that this single business has in the coastal zone. And finally, that due to the level of detail and requirements, as well as the heavy toxins involved in the site, that the corrective action plan should be in the recorded conditions agreement in order to approve the CEQA exemption. Thank you.
And that's 1 minute left.
All right, very good. And with that, we'll bring up the applicant. Once again, 20 minutes. You can use as much or as little as you want and reserve the remainder for rebuttal.
Yep, page 11 on the PDF, please.
Okay.
Thank
There we go. There's a. There you go.
Mr. Mayor, council members, good afternoon. My name is Robert Forzande. I'm the General Counsel and Director of Real Estate Development for Marburg Industries. I'm joined this evening by our entire design team, John Kuykendall, our land use consultant, landscape architect Chris Dufour with RPM, civil engineer Michael Hamilton with RPM, biologist Dave Compton with Dudek, hazardous materials consultant Paul Simonson, and also Derek Carlson, the business development manager at Marburg, and Brian Borgatello, the president of Marburg. My comments tonight will be brief. Mr. Bowman's presentation was very informative and very complete, and we appreciate that presentation. But I do want to address some of the statements that have been made. And our design team, we won't go through the design again, but they're here, they're available, they'll take your comments as needed when the time comes. Now, contrary to the statements made by the appellant, we have a project here before you that's simple. We are taking an existing use that's been used in the same fashion for decades now, and we're taking a site and using it for the exact same thing. Nothing's going to change. It's a storage site. We saw, of the slides we saw one slide that was relevant to the specific site at issue. And you saw it had some flatbeds on there and then some, tow hitches for things. That's what that site has been used for, and that's what the site will continue to be used for. But in the process, what we're doing is we're taking a site that right now, as you've seen in the aerials, is dirt, is unsightly, has eucalyptus trees in the middle, has no screening around the outside, has no bioswale, has no sidewalk. We're taking this site and we're making it nice. We're paving it. We're putting landscaping along the entire perimeter. We are adding the sidewalk on South Quarantina. We're adding the bioswale, and we're screening it just the way staff has been asking us to do throughout this entire development process. We understand that it doesn't look good currently, and we want it to look good. It is a gateway to the community as people come in on that railway. That's why we designed the planted fence the way you've seen it, with the greenery inside and incorporated into the fence. We've done this because we appreciate how important that is to the community. So we are not changing anything about the use of the site. We are not hiring new employees. We are not intensifying our operation. There's not going to be any trash processed here. There's not going to be any liquid waste processed here. None of that is going to be happening here. So we believe that we are doing something great for the neighborhood. We are doing great something for the community. We are making a unsightly, blighted piece of property into something that's much more attractive and aesthetically pleasing. Now, I think for those of you who did visit the site, you'll see how exposed it is on all angles currently. You can see it from the hotel, you can see it from the railway, you can see it from both sides of the street. That's going to be different, and the slides that Mr. Bowman showed earlier directly address that. Now, which leads us to the question of why we're here. And we heard a lot of things from the appellant. We saw a lot of pictures from the appellant. What we didn't see was, again, just one slide that shows this site. She showed a picture of a concrete crushing plant. That's not Marburg. Marburg owns the property, but it leases it. That's fine. I'll proceed.
Go ahead, yeah.
Yes.
Sorry about that.
No, it's okay. Thank you. So the facility is leased to an unrelated, unaffiliated third party. Although Marburg owns the land, it doesn't have anything to do with those operations. We also heard this list of properties that allegedly have no permits. I've been before this council multiple times now. I've heard that same allegation over and over and over and over again. It's been brought to city staff's attention. It's been brought to the building inspector's attention. Every time, everyone says the same thing. All of the state, regional, and local permits for all of these operations are fully in order. There's nothing wrong. The idea that we are running a 9.5-acre project in the middle of the city without permits, that we are crushing concrete, that we are putting pollution in the air right in the middle of the city in front of the coast is so outrageous. But they keep saying the same thing over and over and over again, and it just goes to their credibility, that they would put those photos up on the screen and say that. Now, I think we're all clear that this project will not intensify Marburg's operations. It's just going to continue doing the exact same thing that's been happening, just with a nicer piece of property. And then we talked about the fact that everything is permitted. The city staff has confirmed that numerous times. Finally, we come to this issue of parking. Now, we were here before you on a project about 2 years ago, further up on South Quarantina. We knew this parking issue was going to be an issue, so we took photos as well. We took photos prior to when the Marburg trucks leave the yard, and there's lots of parking. And then 2 hours later, after the Marburg trash trucks have already left and gone out for the day, at like 9:30, that's when the parking filled up. So the solution was obvious. The people at Railroad Square, when Railroad Square was entitled, it was given a 30% parking reduction. They are the ones who are causing the fill on the street. That's where the problem is. It's not Marburg. Marburg has multiple properties, and of course, the appellant left these ones off. There are multiple properties in the adjacent areas that are private property owned by Marburg that's used for parking, that we exclusively have our employees parking on. But we didn't see any of those photos. So the parking issue is a red herring. It's just something, again, that they make up, that they say. And again, we didn't know that the parking was going to be the issue because this project has no improvement to it. As Mr. Bowman indicated, there is no requirement to do parking, so we didn't think parking was relevant. But because it was addressed, I raised that point, that we are not the issue. We have provided private parking on privately owned property in the adjacent areas. Now, with respect to things that actually matter to this property, there was some brief comments about the CEQA exemption, the soil remediation plan. The only issue here is lead. Lead is not hazardous until it's disturbed. So because of that, on all projects like this, EHS needs to have the flexibility to then make modifications based on what happens on the ground. When the dirt is disturbed, they come out. They have continuing jurisdiction to look over the project. And if there's more, then they need to make adjustments. If there's less, they need to make adjustments. So that's why in these situations, there isn't a condition of approval at the very beginning. It just says follow EHS's plans. And that's exactly what we intend to do. And that's exactly what the Planning Commission ordered us to do. So with that, I'll reserve the remainder of our time. Again, our entire design team is here. We are ready to answer any questions that you may have, and I thank you for your consideration.
All right, very good. I mark you as 12 and a half minutes of reserved time. And with that, we'll return back to staff. Do you have any comments regarding the two presentations? Okay, very good. With that, we'll go to the public comments that we have on this, and this is for people making comments but not necessarily part of the project team either way, either on appellate or applicant. We'll start out with Sheila Lodge, please, from Planning Commission. And Mayor Lodge, you have 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor and council members. Mr. Baumann did do a very good job of, do I need to do this? A very, very good job of explaining, of responding to the appellant's issues. Her cumulative impacts are, what's before you is just what the Planning Commission looked at, which is what the applicant just spoke to. The area that has been storage, is to be storage, and is simply not going to have any additional impacts one way or another on coastal access or parking or what have you. Conditions don't change. It's the conditions of the property itself and just of the part next to the railroad, not the rest of it. And instead, there will be improved landscaping. This bit that was found to be considered wetland will be restored. The contaminated soil will be removed, and the stormwater will be properly managed when this property is done. But again, there's not going to be any change of use, any intensity increase of use, any further impacts. And what's before you is just what the Planning Commission reviewed, not all the rest of Marburg's property. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Lodge. Appreciate that. Next speaker up is Hillary Hauser.
Good afternoon, Mayor Rouse and honorable members of the council. It's really good to be back in this room. It's been a while. And I'm very glad to be here on this issue. I want to preface my remarks by saying that Heal the Ocean and Marburg are very much partnering on a number of projects that are for the benefit of the community. The homeless camp cleanup, the boats off the beach, the styrofoam program. So I'm prejudiced and I am very disappointed to see this big attack on Marburg. I really feel that this complaint goes way beyond the issue before you. But Heal the Ocean is here to support the Planning Commission approval of this project and deny Anna Maria Gott appeal. There's a lot about this project we like. We like the soil remediation, the wetlands restoration, and the biofiltration, and so forth. Heal the Ocean works very closely with EHS Site Mitigation Unit, SMU. There are a lot of projects that are before the Planning Commission that we examine every single one. We look them up on GeoTracker and we see what the contamination is. And if we see an area that can be improved in the project, we bring it up to Planning Commission and or the developers directly. We have a couple of those situations going on now. But the deal is that for a project to be remediated, the construction has to start. And EHS, as has been pointed out in previous testimony, that EHS is there to see what happened. On that fourth lot, SMU, the Site Mitigation Unit guys, are there to see what comes up, and then there's remediation. And so it will be handled if the project is approved, and I urge the council to deny the appeal and approve the project. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Hauser. Okay, with that, the appellant has her time reserved at 1 minute, if you'd care to use that for rebuttal, and I'll wait for the clerk to cue you in. Ms. Gorman.
And I believe, yes, you are now unmuted. Do you need your PowerPoint up, Ms. Gott, or are you okay to go?
No, I think I'm fine without having the PowerPoint up.
Okay.
Quickly, I did send an email to the City Council. It has a letter that is dated July 29th, 2016, from your city staff to someone, and it says on the very last page, and this is related to the Lash construction project site, that there has been no permanent activity associated with Lash Construction's payment materials recycling crushing facility. The city of Santa Barbara actually, does not have any CDPs or, actual building permits that have been approved. And for many of the properties that I spoke about, during the presentation. Finally, I have no problem with the project itself and the remediation. What I have a problem with is the fact that we're not looking at the cumulative effects of this development in this area by this company, whose employees take up virtually all of the parking in the area when they come to work for Marburg and then leave on their garbage trucks for the entire day before coming back in the late afternoon. All of the on-street parking is taken by them, period.
End of time.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Gott.
Thank you very much.
Okay, the applicant now has their reserved time, as much as you'd care to use.
I won't need all that. Mr. Mayor, council members, the appellant just talked about a Lash construction project. So again, I'm not sure how that's pertinent. And with respect to the parking, they can continue to make the allegations. They can continue to make the allegations. There's no, it's not us. Again, we provided evidentiary pictures at the last hearing on the other project several years ago showing that those street parkings fill up after 8:30, after regular business hours open, and after our trucks have already departed. So they're clearly not our employees who are taking up Quarantina Street. It's coming from Railroad Square. There can be no doubt about that, especially in light of the fact that Railroad Square was entitled with a 30% parking reduction. So those are all my comments, and again, we are open to answer any questions. Our whole design team is here. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. As you're well under time. So Very good. With that, we will come back to council for questions and then comments. Any questions from council? All right, seeing none, we will move to deliberations. Mr. Jordan.
I'll jump in. I was actually on the Planning Commission on some of the prior referenced the parking comments that were made, and that was in fact exactly as explained by the project applicant. Visual studies were conducted to actually show that there was little to no relationship on the street with Marburg's deployed refuse staff at the time. Just cut to the chase. I find all the stated concerns either not applicable or sufficiently addressed. The applicant could continue to do the same operations that they're doing already with the impacts that they have already without bringing this project before the city. And how fortunate are we that we actually have a partner in the community that chooses to make all the improvements to this site that benefit obviously both them, but also benefit the community. They're going to, that whole area, as most of us I think know, is just a quagmire of bad soil. They're going to do the soil remediation. They're going to resurrect wetland protection. They're going to do incorporate the existing treescape on Carantina with a new sidewalk. They're going to do screening, and all while continuing to do nothing more than they're doing there already on not a piece of soil, a piece of dirt, as it was called, because there's a difference in those two things. So I don't have any problem supporting the Planning Commission's decision and denying the appeal.
Very good. Mr. Friedman.
Thanks. I'll be brief. I agree with everything Councilmember Jordan just said. This is the same use. It's not intensifying the area. It will beautify the area. From the information provided, 2097 doesn't apply in this instance because it's 2/3 of a mile away from the train station versus half a mile. And then also in the staff report in regards to parking, because it's an industrial storage yard without a building, that affects what parking is required. And in this case, according to our municipal code, that reduces and eliminates it. And then the project is the project before us. It's not all the different parcels that are out there. So I'm come to the same conclusion as Councilmember Jordan, and I won't be. I'll be denying the appeal.
Very good. Well, as for me, I'm very happy, as should be all of the neighbors, that this improvement's happening to that area, which is sorely in need of such an improvement. So I will also be voting to deny the appeal, and I'd also like to thank Commissioner Lodge for coming in this afternoon and supporting the Planning Commission. Mr. Jordan, you have a comment?
So I'll make the motion to deny the appeal, uphold the Planning Commission's approval of the coastal development permit and the determination of the CEQA exemption, making those required findings from that Planning Commission resolution as shown by staff, and direct staff to return to council with a decision and findings resolution reflecting the outcome today.
Thank you. Motion by Jordan.
That.
Second by Friedman. Madam Clerk, if you would, please.
Very good. This is the motion by Councilmember Jordan as stated at approximately 5:11 p.m. this evening, seconded by Councilmember Friedman. Ready for the vote? Councilmember Snedden?
Yes.
Councilmember Jordan?
Yes.
Councilmember Harmon?
Yes.
Councilmember Friedman?
Yes.
Councilmember Oscar Gutierrez has stepped away and is not present for the vote. And Mayor Rouse.
Aye, and so that passes 5-0, but
Very good.
unanimously for all the present for the vote, so
Very
thank you
good.
very much.
And Councilmembers Oscar Gutierrez and Alejandro Gutierrez absent for the vote.
All right, very good. We'll move to council and staff communication and/or council engagements. Anyone? Mr. Friedman?
All right, so I got to go through my calendar here, but I attended a walk on Hope Avenue to look at some of the ongoing challenges there with our staff and some residents of the area, the Veracruz Village grand opening, the Southern California Edison wildfire mitigation briefing, and Sustainability Committee, and the Chamber State of the County, attended with others. Also attended a fun event, a couple of them in the summer, is Environmental Defense Center, TGIF. It was a great event, and I think that is everything. Yep, that is everything. Thank you.
All right, very good. Well, I had a pretty relaxing weekend myself. I started with a rope rescue simulation with Councilmember Jordan on the cliffs of Wilcox property, followed by the Yacht Club's Visiting Nurse and Hospice Regatta, which raises hundreds of thousands of dollars for visiting nurses in hospice. And then wrapped that up with the organ donation celebration at the beach with organ donors from Santa Barbara. And then on Sunday was the Heroes of Hospice luncheon at the Rosewood Miramar, and followed up by the Police Foundation's Fun with the Force at the Nesbitt property. So, like I said, relaxing weekend. Anyway, if there are no other comments or things to share, we will call this a meeting. Thank you very much. We're adjourned.